The cold struck first. Kale opened his eyes and saw a white haze. Snow was blowing into his face, cutting into his skin like sand. He was lying in a snowdrift on the hillside and couldn't feel his toes. The body felt foreign, thin, light. Memories of this foreign body came in fits and starts. His name was Kale, 19 years old, the son of a fallen hunter from the settlement of Hargate, the weakest in the settlement. That morning, Elder Torvald led him outside the palisade and said that winter had dragged on too long and there wasn't enough food to go around. The elder said that extra mouths would be sent out into the snow. That's what they called banishment in Hargate. Kale sat down in a snowdrift and looked up at the gray sky. He realized this wasn't a dream. He had died there and woken up here. He didn't dwell on it. There was no time to dwell on it. His body was losing heat. He knew that feeling on his skin. First, a burning sensation, then numbness, then a sleep from which one never wakes. His body's memory told him it was an hour's walk to the nearest rocky ridge. There were crevices there. The wind couldn't reach them. Kale got up and set off. One step, another step. He counted his steps so as not to think about the cold. In his past life, he counted 2. Only back then, he'd count the lines and reports and the days until payday. The thought flashed through his mind and faded. Now the count was in hours of life. The ridge rose from the blizzard like a dark wall. Kale found a crevice 2 shoulders wide and squeezed inside. The wind stayed outside. Inside, it was quiet and dark. He slid down the rock and wrapped his arms around his knees. And then a cold blue light flashed in his mind. Lines appeared before his eyes. Polar Refuge system activated. Host recognized as suitable. Level 0 shelter detected. First structure accessible. Warm room. Cost, 10 units of heat. Current supply, 10 units. Kale stared at the lines, holding his breath. Then he exhaled. He didn't ask himself where this was coming from. He saw the numbers, and the numbers added up to a chance. He mentally tapped the structure's line. The rock beneath him trembled. The walls of the crevice melted like wax. The cracks closed. The floor leveled out. A niche emerged from the rock containing a bench made of smooth, warm stone. In the corner, a yellow crystal the size of a fist lit up, radiating warmth. Smooth, dry, real. Kale pressed his palms against the crystal, and for the first time that day, stopped trembling. The system displayed new lines. Construction complete. A warm first-level room. Reward for the host. Strength +2. Stamina +2. He felt the reward immediately. A wave of heat coursed through his muscles. His thin arms grew firmer. His breathing deepened. He clenched his fist and looked at it. Yesterday's Kale wouldn't have been able to bend a horseshoe. Today's Kale still couldn't either. But there was already a difference. The system explained the rules in a few short lines. Every structure in the shelter strengthens the bearer. Heat is a resource. Heat is drawn from fire, from the bodies of beasts, and from the workings of the structures. The shelter grows downward and outward. The host grows along with it. Kale leaned back on the cot and laughed. The laugh came out hoarse and short. The world of eternal winter had cast him out to die, and yet he had obtained a tool to combat winter itself. Then the laughter ended. Hunger set in. His stomach clenched, reminding him that this foreign body hadn't eaten in 2 days. Warmth without food was only a temporary reprieve. Kale opened the construction menu and scrolled through the available options. A hearth with a brazier, a glacier for storing meat, a meltwater filter. Everything required heat units, but he had none. The system suggested there was a source nearby. 100 steps down the slope lay the carcass of a snow deer. The beast had fallen from the cliff and frozen to death. The residual heat from the carcass could be absorbed. The meat could be eaten. Kale looked toward the exit of the room. Outside, a blizzard was howling. It was warm inside, and he just wanted to lie there. He forced himself to get up. In his past life, he'd known how to do one useful thing. He knew how to plan ahead when everyone around him lived only for the moment. Planning boiled down to one simple fact. Whoever lies in the warmth without supplies will die in the warmth. He stepped out into the blizzard and walked downhill, counting his steps. He found the carcass by the hump visible beneath the snow. It was a large deer. Kale placed his palm on the frozen flank and activated absorption. Blue sparks ran across the carcass. The system credited him with 8 units of heat. Then Kale pulled a bone knife from the belt of the dead animal and spent 3 hours cutting the frozen meat. His hands were cramping. He warmed them under his armpits and continued cutting. He carried as much as he could lift into the crevice. Then he returned and carried more, then more. By nightfall, a mountain of dark red chunks lay in the corner of the warm room. Kale built a hearth for 5 units and a roasting pan for 3. The system rewarded him again. Intelligence +1. Dexterity +1. His thoughts became a little faster, his fingers a little more precise. He roasted the meat on a red-hot stone and ate it without salt or bread. It was the best meal of both his lives. The feeling of fullness went to his head like wine. Kale lay down on the cot and began to think. The system displayed a development tree. The branches extended deep into the system. Residential tier, engineering tier, greenhouse tier, armory tier. Almost all the branches were gray and labeled the same way. Specialist required. Kale looked at these lines and frowned. He could build walls and hearths, but the medical wing required someone who knew how to heal. The forge required someone who knew how to forge. The shelter wasn't designed for a lone individual. It was designed for the people the host would bring under his roof. The system confirmed his hunch with a separate line. For every resident saved and accepted, the host receives a permanent boost and access to the resident's branch. Kale snorted. It turned out that winter itself was pushing him to gather people. He didn't mind. He remembered what it was like to be alone and feel like a burden. He fell asleep to the roar of the blizzard and slept without dreams. In the morning, a sound woke him. The crunch of snow underfoot. Someone was walking along the ridge. Kale dimmed the crystal to a faint glow and grabbed his knife. A shadow flashed in the doorway. A man in a tattered fur cloak peered inside. Kale recognized him. It was Skeggy, the scavenger from Hargate, the very same one who had laughed the loudest yesterday when Kale was led out through the gates. Skeggy followed in the footsteps of the exiles, stripping shoes and belts from the dead. He had come for Kale's body. Instead of a body, he saw a warm room with a hearth and a mountain of meat. Skeggy froze in the doorway. His eyes darted over the smooth walls, the crystal, and the roasting pan. His jaw dropped. He backed away and pressed his back against the edge of the doorway. He muttered that this was impossible. That yesterday there had been nothing but a bare crack in the stone here. That Kale, a weakling, must have frozen to death before sunset. Kale looked at him silently, warming his hands over the brazier. Inside, he felt calm and cold. Yesterday's Kale would have shrunk back into himself. Today's Kale was weighing his options. Skeggy would run to Hargate and spread the news about the warm den with meat. The news would reach Elder Torvald. Torvald would decide that the outcast's possessions belonged to the settlement. Kale told the scavenger that he could take one piece of meat and leave, and that if Skeggy brought outsiders here, their next meeting would end differently. Skeggy grabbed the piece and vanished into the blizzard faster than Kale could finish speaking. Kale stepped outside after him and watched him go. The scavenger's trail led east toward Hargate. Kale went back inside and opened the menu. He built the second room deeper into the rock, then a narrow, throat-like tunnel with a bend so a spear couldn't reach him from the threshold, then a stone door on grooves. The system showered him with rewards. Strength +3, endurance +2, intelligence +1. His body changed with every structure he built. His shoulders broadened, his back straightened. He lifted a boulder he wouldn't have been able to move yesterday and wedged it in place as a bolt. By evening, he no longer had just his shelter, but a small bunker with a 2-week supply of meat. Kale stood in the middle of his first haul and listened to the eternal winter raging outside. For the first time, winter was howling not above him, but past him. He allowed himself 1 minute of rest, exactly 1. Then he sat down by the brazier and began planning his defense. Because Skeggy had already reached Hargate, and in a year of famine, human greed moves faster than any blizzard. Kale was also thinking about something else. That afternoon, in the snow near a reindeer carcass, he'd seen tracks. Wide. 4-toed. With claw marks as long as a finger. His body's memory identified the beast. A frost beast. An icy predator the size of an ox. Frost beasts would come out to the cliffs when they sensed heat and blood. And today, Kale had left a trail of blood across half the slope. That night, it wasn't the wind that woke him. He was roused by the scraping of claws against stone right by the door. The scraping sound repeated. Then something heavy struck the door and the stone bolt wobbled. Kale leapt up from his bunk and pressed his back against the tunnel wall. His heart was pounding against his ribs. He opened the system panel and his eyes scanned the lines. Heat reserve, 21 units. Available defensive structures. Spikes in the tunnel for 6 units. Trap chimney for 8. Door reinforcement for 5. Outside, the attacker struck again, and a piece of stone chipped off the door. Kale forced himself to think slowly. In a past life, he had once saved a project by reworking the entire work plan overnight while everything was burning and everyone were screaming. The skill was strange for a world of swords, but it worked. Panic wastes time. A plan saves lives. Kale invested 5 units in the door, and the stone of the door doubled in thickness. The blows from outside grew muffled. Then he built spikes. Faceted stone teeth grew out of the tunnel floor behind the door, angled inward. A beast could stick its snout through but wouldn't be able to pull it back out. He had 10 units left. Kale saved them for later and waited. The waiting was the worst part. The Stuznik pounded on the door until dawn. Then silence fell. The silence turned out to be worse than the pounding. Kale sat there with a knife in his hand for another hour. Then the system flashed a line of text. A large heat source, 30 paces from the entrance, is moving north. The beast was gone. Kale exhaled and unclenched his fingers from the hilt. His palm had gone numb of pain. He realized something simple. The door and the spikes had saved him that night, but the beast would return or another would come. A bunker needs more than just walls. A bunker needs towers that strike first, and the towers hum in the gray branch and demanded an engineering tier. The tier demanded resources that Kale didn't have. Iron, combustible stone, heat crystals. None of this was found in his rock. He had to search for all of this outside. Kale ate some roasted meat, packed his bag, and stepped out into the daylight. The blizzard had died down. The frost was so biting that a spit of saliva would ring against the snow crust. Kale headed north, following the trail of the frost walker. The plan seemed insane, but the logic was simple. A beast as heavy as an ox was a walking storehouse of heat. The system absorbs heat from carcasses. A single snow leopard carcass could yield more units than a week's worth of firewood gathering, and Kale had no intention of killing the beast. He planned to find its trail and set a trap from the defense menu along it. A spiked pit trap cost 12 units and could be built anywhere the creature's paw touched the ground. The trail led across the white field toward the fissure. Kale reached the edge of the fissure and heard a sound he hadn't expected, the clang of steel. Down at the bottom of the fissure, a battle was raging, or rather, the battle was already ending. 3 figures in gray hides had a fourth pinned against the icy wall. The fourth was a girl. Tall. Copper-colored hair splayed out from under her hood, a long sword in her hands. She held her stance the way people who train since childhood do, but her left leg was buckling, and a red trail stretched behind her in the snow. The 3 in furs were in no hurry. They were savoring the moment. Kale's body memory recognized the gray furs, the wolf hooks, a gang that preyed on trade routes and sold captives to southern middlemen. They wouldn't kill a girl with a sword like that. They'd take her alive and the price would be high. Kale lay down on the edge of the ravine and began to count. He was alone. His only weapon was a bone knife. Against 3 men with axes, the odds were laughable. But he had something the gang didn't. He had the system and 26 units of heat left over from gathering firewood that morning and consuming small carcasses along the way. He looked at the ledge above the gang's trail. Snow hummed from the ledge in a heavy cap. Kale touched the edge of the ledge with his palm and mentally conjured the cheapest item on the menu onto the ledge, a heating crystal for 4 units. The crystal flared up inside the cap of snow. The snow began to melt within 10 breaths. The cap groaned and started to slide down. An avalanche buried 2 of the 3. The third managed to jump out of the way and let out a scream. The girl didn't bother to look at the spectacle. She pushed off the wall and drove her sword into his ribs before he could turn around. Then she dropped to one knee. Kale climbed down the crevice to the bottom of the fault line. The girl raised her sword toward him. The blade trembled, but the eyes above it were clear and fierce. She asked simply who he was. Kale replied that he was the one who had dropped half a snowdrift on her enemies, and that if she wanted to freeze to death here with her head held high, he wouldn't stop her. But if she wanted to live, there was warmth and food an hour's walk away. The girl stared at him for a long time. Then she looked at her leg. The wound was jagged and deep. She sheathed her sword and said her name was Astrid. She said nothing more. The journey back took 3 hours instead of 1. Astrid walked alone and refused Kale's offer of a shoulder to lean on twice. The third time, she silently leaned on him and, all the way to the cliff, looked only at her feet. At the entrance to the bunker, she stopped and smiled through her split lips. She said she'd seen hermits' dens and was ready for the stench and filth. Kale slid the stone bolt aside and led her inside. Astrid took 2 steps and stopped. She stood in the middle of a warm hall with smooth walls, a heating crystal, and a supply of meat along the wall, and her expression changed before his eyes. Her distrust slipped away. Beneath it lay pure amazement. She touched the warm wall with her palm, then again. She said it was colder in the provincial governor's castle in winter, and it was here. She asked how many years it had taken him to build it. Kale replied, 2 days. Astrid looked at him as if he were a liar, then as if he were mad, and then she simply sat down by the brazier and began to laugh. Her laughter turned into a cough. The cough turned into a moan. The wound was sapping her strength. Kale rinsed the wound with melted snow and bound it with a clean strip of leather. He did it clumsily. The system displayed a message stating that the medical module was inaccessible without a specialist. Kale gritted his teeth. He had warmth and food, but he had neither herbs nor medical skills. All he could do was tend to Astrid and keep the wound clean. That night, she developed a fever. She tossed and turned on the cot and spoke in her delirium. Astrid and keep the wound clean. That night, she developed a fever. She tossed and turned on the cot and spoke in her delirium. Kale sat nearby and listened. A story emerged from her delirium. Astrid was the daughter of a swordsman from the retinue of the northern baron Ulfgar. The baron sold his retinue to a southern merchant when the grain ran out. He sold them along with their families. Astrid slaughtered the escort and fled into the snow. The wolf hooks had been her trail for 6 days because a bounty had been placed on her head. By morning, the fever had subsided. Astrid opened her eyes and immediately looked for her sword. The sword lay nearby untouched. Something shifted in her expression. She ate meat and watched as Kale built the third room. The wall seemed to expand before her eyes, and Astrid forgot to chew. Meanwhile, the system displayed the message Kale had been waiting for. Resident with a warrior specialization detected. Admit resident to the shelter. Kale asked Astrid directly. He told her she had nowhere else to go and that she was being hunted. He said he needed someone who knew how to handle a weapon, because all he had was a plan in his head. He offered her a place under this roof and a share in whatever the shelter had to offer. Astrid asked what he would require in return, and her hand rested on the hilt of her sword. Kale replied that he would require honest service and warned her of one thing. The shelter would grow, and there would be more enemies than she had ever seen in her entire life. Astrid smiled wryly and said those were the best terms of employment she'd seen in the past year. She placed her palm in his, following the custom of the northern warbands. The system flashed gold. Resident accepted. Astrid. Specialization, swordswoman. Permanent reward for the bearer. Strength +5, dexterity +3. Branch unlocked, training hall, armory, watchtower. Kale felt his body fill with new power. His muscles hummed. The world slowed down slightly and his movements became a little faster. He bent a bone knife with his fingers and it snapped. Astrid watched this with wide eyes. Meanwhile, Kale was already opening a branch and building a lookout post atop the cliff. A narrow tube with a mirror made of ice provided a view of the entire plateau. And in that mirror, Kale saw something that extinguished the joy of victory in a single breath. From the east, from the direction of Harjit, a chain of dark dots was moving across the snow. Kale counted 11. They weren't moving like merchants or refugees. They were moving in a raid. Skeggi had brought guests. And at the head of the line walked a figure whose physique was familiar to him from memory. Broad, heavy, with a chain staff. Elder Torvald was coming to claim a warm den for one more mouth to feed. Kale climbed down from the watchtower and told Astrid that they had guests, 11 of them. Astrid got up from her cot and staggered. Her leg wasn't holding up well. She said she'd take on 3 of them as she had to stand in a narrow spot. Kale replied that she wouldn't take on anyone because a fight was a last resort, not the first option. He sat down by the brazier and closed his eyes. 11 people. A hungry winter. A greedy old man with power over them. A direct assault on the stone door was beyond their capabilities, but they could lay siege and wait. A siege was worse than axes. Kale opened the menu and checked their supplies. 38 heat units after absorbing the corpses of 2 bandits from the fissure. He placed 12 in a trap pit on the only convenient path leading to the entrance. He covered the pit with brushwood and memorized its edge by a distinctive rock. 8 units went into the smoke trap above the tunnel. He held on to the rest. Then he did something that made Astrid's jaw drop. He took a piece of meat weighing half a puta out of the bunker and placed it on a flat rock about 50 steps from the door, in plain sight. Astrid asked if he'd lost his mind. Kale replied that the mob was dangerous as long as it remained united, and what kept it united was its belief in easy prey. So that belief had to be shattered before the mob reached the door. The chain of people reached the plateau around noon. Kale stood on a ledge above the entrance. The wind tore at his cloak. Below, Hargeet's people had gathered. He knew every one of them. There was Hraven the blacksmith, who had once kicked him out of the smithy. There were the fisherman brothers who had dunked him in an ice hole just for a laugh. Torvald stood at the front, leaning on a chain staff. Skeggi was hiding behind their backs. Torvald raised his head and spoke in the same voice he'd used at the town meeting. He said that Hargeet was starving and that everything found on the settlement's lands belonged to the settlement. He said that Kale, Hargeet's son, and his find were the community's find. He ordered the door to be opened and promised that Kale would be taken back and given a place at the communal pot. The people behind him murmured their approval. Kale listened, and inside he felt calm. Just 3 days ago, those words would have crushed him. Now he saw not a menacing community, but a group of frozen, starving people whom the old man was leading to their doom just to secure a warm corner for himself. Kale replied loudly so that those in the back rows could hear. He said that 3 days ago, Hargeet had called him a mouth too many and dragged him out into the snow to die. He said that the dead do not join the community and therefore the community had no claim to his home. Then he said something else. He said he held no grudge against those who simply wanted to eat. There was meat lying on the rock over there. Anyone who was hungry could take some and leave in peace. But anyone who took a step toward the door with a weapon would find out why the man from the cold had left this rock at night with nothing. The crowd shifted. Half their eyes were glued to the meat on the rock. Torvald sensed the raid falling apart and barked that the boy was lying and stalling for time. He jabbed his staff toward the door and was the first to step forward. Behind him came the blacksmith Hraven with his hammer, along with 3 others who were bolder. The rest remained standing. Kale took note of this. The crowd had already split. Thorvald walked along the path with heavy, confident steps. Kale's gaze fixed on a prominent rock. 1 step. Another step. The snow crust cracked and gave way. The elder plummeted into the pit with a scream that split the crowd in 2. Curses and moans poured out of the pit. Kale had made the spikes blunt and short. He didn't want to kill him. He didn't meet a corpse. He needed to shatter the crowd's fear of the old man. The blacksmith Hraven froze above the pit and looked down at Torvald, who was thrashing about. Then he raised his head to look at Kale. And Kale saw it, the very thing. The face of a man changing. All his life, Hraven had seen Kale as nothing but trash underfoot. Now he saw a ledge on a cliff and a calm young man standing above the trap he built, as if he'd been fighting his whole life. Hraven lowered his hammer. He asked without his usual arrogance if it was true that it was warm inside. Kale replied that it was true, and he added what he'd been thinking about since that morning. He said he wouldn't let the crowd with axes inside, but he would trade warmth and food for labor and resources. Iron, firestone, hides, skilled hands. Hargeet could fight him and freeze to death, or he could trade with him and survive the winter. The crowd began to murmur differently than before. They pulled Torvald out of the pit. The old man had lost his staff and half his voice. He wheezed that the community would return. No one listened to him. The people divided the meat from the stone fairly and made their way back toward Hargeet. Hraven was the last to leave, glancing back repeatedly at the smooth stone door. Astrid emerged from the tunnel once the plateau had emptied. She said she'd seen commanders crush rebellions with blood, but this was the first time she'd seen a rebellion crushed with a piece of meat and a pit. She said this without a trace of mockery. Kale replied that blood is expensive, but meat is cheap. That evening, the system summarized the day's events. The carrier's authority has increased. The reputation parameter for the region has been unlocked. Kale was studying the new tab when the watchtower detected movement to the south. Sleds were creeping along the trade trail across the plateau. 3 sleds and a guard detail of 6 men in identical gray furs, the wolf hooks. Astrid pressed her face against the icy mirror and her expression turned to stone. She said it was a slave trader caravan and that the sleds, hidden beneath the furs, were carrying live cargo. She said she knew this route. The pass leads to the southern middleman, the very one to whom her companion had been sold. She was already heading toward the weapons counter. Kale grabbed her by the shoulder. He said that 6 guards were not the same as 3 herders in the ravine, and that her leg wouldn't hold up during a long fight. Astrid snarled that she wouldn't stand by and watch people being hauled off to be sold. Kale replied that no one would just stand by and watch. There would be a plan. The plan was this. The trail ran through a gorge between 2 cliffs. Kale reached the spot in an hour, touched a rock, and channeled nearly his entire heat reserve into 2 structures. A heating crystal in the snow-covered canopy above the gorge, and a spiked moat across the trail, immediately beyond the canopy, concealed by snowdrifts. Astrid took up position on the left cliff with the bow she'd taken from a dead bandit. The sled entered the gorge at sunset. The crystal flared. The canopy collapsed, cutting off the rear pair of guards from the front pair. The front pair surged forward and plunged into the trench. Astrid took out the two in the rear before they could dig themselves out of the snow. The remaining two abandoned the sled and ran off. Kale stepped onto the trail and didn't chase after them. He opened the sled. Beneath the frozen animal hides lay bound people. 8 people, half dead from the cold. Women and teenagers from ravaged villages. And in the last sled, lying apart from the others, was a girl with her hands bound behind her back and a gag in her mouth. The symbols of the Southern Temple of Mercy were sewn onto her cloak. Kale removed the gag, and the girl's first request was for water, not for herself, but for the boy in the first sled, whose fingers were turning black. Her name was Leora. She was a temple healer. The middlemen had taken her from the ransacked outpost because a healer in the south was worth more than 3 swordsmen. The entire way with her hands bound, she instructed the guards on how to keep the cargo from dying. Kale led the caravan to the bunker by midnight. The 8 survivors entered the warm hall, and Kale watched yet again a spectacle that never grew tiresome. People touched the warm walls and wept. Leora did not weep. She sprang into frantic action. She demanded boiling water, clean strips of leather, and a place by the fire. She tended to the frostbitten victims one by one. Her hands moved with such skill that watching her was a pleasure in itself. She saved the hand of the boy with blackened fingers using some kind of tincture from her miraculously intact bag. Then she examined Astrid's leg and scolded Kale so harshly for the bandage that Astrid snickered into her fist. By dawn, Leora sat down by the brazier and finally took a good look around. She asked Kale what kind of place this was and why the barons weren't fighting over such a stronghold. Kale offered her the same he'd offered Astrid: a place, a share, protection, and work that made use of her gift, because his house was full of people and there was no one to treat them. Leora looked at the sleeping survivors and said that the temple had taught her one thing: to stay where you're needed most. Here she was needed more than anywhere else. The system flashed. Resident accepted. Leora. Specialization, healer. Reward for the bearer, stamina +5, intelligence +3. Branch unlocked. Medical wing. Herb greenhouse. Purification well. Kale had been building the medical wing since early morning and could feel his mind growing sharper. His thoughts fell into place on their own, like lines in a perfect report. But one thought was colder than the rest. He had taken a caravan of goods from the Wolf Hooks. Gangs forgive the deaths of their rank and file. Gangs do not forgive the loss of money. And 2 more guards had escaped alive and carried away the tail of the rock that drops snow and digs trenches. A day later, the watchtower confirmed the price of success. On the southern edge of the plateau, a lone rider on a shaggy horse stood gazing at the cliff. He stood there for an hour. Then he turned and rode south. Astrid glanced in the mirror and said one word: Scout. The scout did not return the next day or the day after that. Kale knew this was not mercy but preparation. He used every moment of silence as a resource. The bunker expanded downward. The second level took in 8 survivors. Leora set up a medical unit and a herb greenhouse where the first sprouts were turning green beneath yellow crystals. Astrid was putting 3 teenagers from the caravan who had volunteered for the patrol through their paces in the training hall. The system paid out reliably for every structure, and Kale no longer recognized himself in the icy mirror. His shoulders were like those of a hammer thrower. His gaze was quick. His stride was silent. His strength had surpassed 3 times that of an ordinary person. And then Hargate arrived. Not in a raid. One by one. First came a fisherman crawling along with his frostbitten wife on a sled. Behind him, a coal miner's family. Behind them, more and more. The settlement supplies ran out sooner than Torvald had anticipated, and people headed where, according to rumors, it was warm. Kale stood by the door and watched the procession of those who, a month ago, had remained silent as he was led out into the snow. Something dark and evil rose up inside him. He allowed that feeling exactly one breath. Then he turned his mind to reason. People are hands. Hands are structures. Structures are power. The revenge of the weak is a slammed door. The revenge of the strong is a line of former tormentors waiting for his warmth. He laid out his conditions at the threshold briefly and uniformly. Work for warmth. Resources for food. Weapons are surrendered at the entrance. Anyone who disrupts order is sent out into the snow without a word. People agreed to everything. By the end of the week, 40 people were living beneath the cliff. Fraven arrived among the last to arrive. The blacksmith carried his anvil on his back as a ransom and kept his eyes downcast. Kale accepted the anvil and said that the past would remain in the past, until the first act of treachery. The system recorded the population growth as a new entry. The shelter had reached the rank of outpost. The third tier was now accessible. The outer wall was now accessible. Kale built the wall for 3 days straight, extracting heat from everything that burned. A gray granite belt rose around the entrance 2-man heights high. At the corners, the first 2 defensive towers from the military branch were erected. Inside the towers, mechanisms slumbered, ready to hurl sharpened ice spears with the force of steam. When the first tower fired a test volley and his spear pierced a boulder on the plateau right through, the entire outpost poured out to watch. And Kale staggered from the reward. Strength +7, intelligence +4, authority +5. He steadied himself and thought that soon he would begin to fear himself. Trouble came from the direction they least expected. From the north, a crowd carrying torches emerged onto the plateau amid the blizzard. Kale counted about 50 people through his spyglass and froze at the sight of them. They were neither bandits nor refugees. Leading the way were people in white robes with a black sun sewn onto them. His body's memory recognized them, and a chill ran down Kale's spine, one not caused by the frost. The servants of the Black Sun. The northern cult that blames sorcerers for the eternal winter. The cult traveled from settlement to settlement, burning anyone they suspected of having a gift. A mob always trailed behind the cult. Hungry people like it when someone points the finger at a culprit. The cult stopped 300 paces from the wall and pushed a bound figure forward. A girl, very young. White hair down to her waist, a torn dress unsuitable for the weather. She stood barefoot in the snow and did not shiver. The snow around her feet melted and immediately refroze into smooth rings. The cult's leader bellowed over the wind, explaining why he had come. He said they had captured an ice witch whose curse brought on the cold. He said that, according to custom, the witch would be burned at dawn in full view of all honest people, and he demanded that the outpost provide firewood, food, and lodging for the servants of the righteous cause. He also said that rumors had reached the cult about a rock where a stone moves on its own, and that after the bonfire, the servants would go inside and check that place for corruption. Kale listened and did the math. 50 fanatics, 2 towers, 20 combat-ready men behind the wall. The math was on his side. But behind the math lay something else. The cult's crowd was made up of the same starving peasants. A volley from the towers would turn Kale into a new, terrifying northern legend, and the next cult would bring 500 people to the wall, not 50. He looked at the girl by the pillar. The system watched with him and displayed a line that made Kale's throat go dry. A bearer of the gift of elemental ice detected. Specialization potential, exceptional. Recommendation, accept the resident. Leora stood beside him on the wall and said quietly that she had seen the cult's bonfires to the south. She said that if he was going to do anything, he had to do it before dawn. Astrid silently checked her bowstring. Kale ordered both of them to prepare the infirmary and an emergency exit. As for himself, he did what no one expected of him. He opened the gate and went out to face the cult alone, unarmed, with a sack on his back. He walked across the plateau, feeling 50 pairs of eyes on him. The cult leader stared at him like a raven eyeing carrion. Kale stopped 10 paces away and spoke loudly. He said that the outpost honored the customs of the north and would not interfere with a righteous cause. He said he had brought food for the cultists, as was customary. And he untied the sack and dumped a mountain of roasted meat onto the snow. The crowd behind the robes leaned forward with their whole bodies. Kale continued. He said that a bonfire wouldn't catch fire until noon in such a wind, and that wet firewood would disgrace the ritual. And at his outpost there was a stone courtyard sheltered from the wind. Let the priests enter with the witch and perform the ritual in the morning as is proper, in the warmth after a hot broth. The high priest hesitated. The hungry crowd decided for him. People were already grabbing meat and shouting that the rock was blessed since it was feeding a righteous cause. The cult entered the gates at sunset. Kale stationed 50 people in the outer courtyard, fed them soup until they were stuffed, and set out a barrel of Harjit mead from the fresh supplies. By midnight, the courtyard was snoring in unison. The servants slept by the braziers, relaxed for the first time all winter. The pillar with the girl stood in the middle of the courtyard. Kale approached the post in the darkness. The girl's eyes followed him the whole way. Up close, he saw that her lips were chapped and that her wrists beneath the ropes were covered in a mixture of ice and blood. The ropes were soaked in salt and fat to counteract her gift. Kale cut the ropes and whispered that in the far corner of the courtyard there was a passage leading down, that it was warm there, and that no one would harm her. The girl rubbed her wrists and asked, also in a whisper, why he was doing this if her gift really could be the cause of the cold. Kale replied that he had lived alongside eternal winter for the entire lifetime of this body, and that winter had been eternal long before the girl was born. He also said that he wasn't giving away his own. She asked since when she was one of his own. He replied that it had been since he opened the passage down below. She snorted. The sound was almost a laugh. She gave her name, Sigrun. In the morning, the cult awoke to find the pillar empty. The elder raised a howl about the defilement and demanded that the rock be searched. Kale stood before him, surrounded by his own people, playing the best role of his new life. He shouted that the witch had bewitched his men and fled into the blizzard, and that his men had seen her trail on the northern path. He stamped his feet and demanded that the cult immediately pursue the source of the evil before it got away. He gave the pursuers a bag of food for the journey. The cult leader looked at him long and hard. Then the cult set off northward into the white haze. Kale knew that the leader didn't fully believe him. He knew that the cult would return with reinforcements. That was the price. He had paid it knowingly. Sigrun emerged from the passageway as the gates closed. In the courtyard, in the light of day, it became clear just how exhausted she was. Leora took her to the medical wing for 2 days. On the third day, Sigrun found Kale on the wall. She said she'd overheard the residents talking about the growing stone and about the master of the cliff, who was growing stronger with every wall. She said she spent her whole life running from people because they feared her gift, and that for the first time, she saw a place where her gift might not be a curse, but a calling. She asked if he would take her in. Kale held out his hand. The system flashed brighter than it ever had before. Resident accepted. Sigrun. Specialization, Ice Mage. Reward for the bearer, Intelligence +8, Strength +4. The Elemental Structures branch has been unlocked. Icy Bastion, Frosty Air Forge, Reservoir of Deep Cold. Kale read the names and realized that the outpost was no longer just a hole in the ground with towers. And that evening, Sigrun demonstrated what her branch was capable of. She stood on the wall, stretched out her arms, and, following the system's blueprint, grew a second wall of blue ice, stronger than steel, on top of the granite belt. The residents below looked up, their heads tilted back. Raven shook his head and kept saying that ice doesn't behave like that. And from the watchtower, a scream rang out from one of the new guards. The boy was shouting and pointing south. Kale pressed his face against the mirror. A dark mass was moving toward the plateau from the south. Not 50, 150. A banner bearing a wolf's hook fluttered above the mass. The gang had come for their caravan and was bringing along everyone they could hire. And at the head of the gang, 4 beasts in riveted armor trudged heavily along. Tame stud beasts on chains. The gang set up camp at the edge of the plateau, out of the tower's range. Kale looked at the campfires and realized that the wolf hooks had taken the survivors' accounts into account. There would be no immediate assault. It would be at night. At night, the tower's mechanisms aim less accurately, and the beasts see better than humans. He gathered his people in the main hall. Astrid and 3 sentries were holding the wall. Leora was preparing the infirmary and heating cauldrons of boiling water. Sigrun stood on the ice belt as the main defense. Fran and Hargate's men were on standby with drinks at the gate, 40 against 150. Kale laid out the plan and saw in their faces what he had once seen on the faces of his colleagues before a missed deadline. Fear multiplied by distrust. Back then, he knew how to quell it with numbers. He started with numbers now, too. He said that the enemy would have to cross 300 paces of open plateau under a barrage of fire, that he had turned every step the enemy took into work, and that, at best, only a third of them would make it to the wall. Then he channeled the remaining heat into the 3rd tower and into the network of heating crystals buried in the snow across the entire field. A moonless night fell. The frost beasts roared in the darkness, and their roar rolled across the plateau ahead of the attack. The gang sent the beasts in first. 4 armored beasts charged toward the gate, followed in 2 waves by the infantry carrying ladders. Kale stood on the wall, his hand raised. He waited. The first beast crossed the 200-step mark. Kale lowered his hand. Sigrun struck first. She didn't strike the beasts. Instead, she froze the ground in front of them into a smooth, sloping mirror. The beasts, having lost their momentum, lost their footing and tumbled, breaking the infantry's formation behind them. Volley after volley from the towers struck the chaos. Icy spears pierced the beasts' riveted armor at 50 paces. 2 of the beasts were left lying on the ground. 2 got to their feet and made it to the gate. The first one slammed into the gate, and the gate held. Astrid met the second one from the wall. She leaped down onto the beast's back and drove her sword into the gap between the armor plates, right where Leora, who knew the beast's anatomy from medical atlases, had told her to strike. The beast collapsed. Astrid rolled away from the carcass and dodged the axe of the first bandit to reach her, as if her leg had never hurt at all. The gang's foot soldiers rolled up to the wall in scattered groups. Crystals in the pavement flashed beneath the runners' feet, causing them to fall into the crumbling pits. Craven and the Hargate men were throwing down ladders. Sigrun was freezing the ropes with hooks along with the hands that held them. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the gang had broken ranks and fled. Cale ordered them not to pursue. He stood on a wall looking down at the plateau strewn with bodies and felt no joy. He felt exhaustion and the toll of the battle. 2 of his own had died, a fisherman from Hargate and a teenage sentry who had stuck his head out under an arrow. Cale remembered both by name. The system was calculating the heat from the enemy's cooling bodies, and the stockpile figures were spinning upward like a counter. By dawn, the reserve had surpassed 400 units. Cale had never possessed such wealth. He didn't spend it on towers. Instead, beneath the 3rd tier, he built a memorial hall with 2 stone slabs and carved the names onto them. Residents came down there all day long. That evening, Leora told him that for this single structure alone, people would follow him farther than they would for any wall. In the morning, the sentry reported movement on the battlefield. Someone was stirring among the gang's abandoned supply train. Astrid went down with a trio of fighters and returned with a strange discovery. In the Wolfhook's supply train stood a wrought iron cage on runners, and inside the cage sat a girl wearing a scorched leather apron over a tattered shirt. Her hands were covered in old burns and fresh scrapes. Her eyes were as fierce as a badger's. It couldn't open the cage, neither with the keys from the dead wagon driver nor with a crowbar. The girl in the cage explained why herself. She said the lock was her own creation and that it opened with a clever sequence she refused to reveal to the bandits. That was why she was being transported in the cage all the way to the far south. Her name was Brenna. She was the daughter of a weaponsmith from the fallen city of Kaldheim. The gang had burned down her father's workshop and was taking her to be sold to a southern dealer because her blacksmithing skills were worth as much as 10 swordsmen. The entire way, she sharpened the gang's weapons while under guard and tried to escape 3 times. Cale crouched down by the cage and asked what she wanted. Brenna replied that she wanted 3 things: a hammer, a horn, and one day the head of the Wolfhook's chieftain on her anvil. Cale said he already had the first 2 things today, and as for the third, they had plans in common. Brenna stared at him through the bars for a long time. Then her fingers flitted across the lock faster than the eye could follow, and the door opened. She stepped out, stretched her back, and demanded to see the horn before dinner. Brenna spent an hour in the blacksmith's corner of the courtyard where Hrabma's anvil stood. She felt the metal, tapped it, listened to the ring, and grimaced. She said it was usable, but that it was only good for village horseshoes. Cale smiled and opened a menu before her that only he could see. A line was already flashing on the system display. Resident with blacksmithing specialization of exceptional rank detected. Cale offered Brenna the same thing he offered everyone else. A place. A share. Protection. Work suited to her gift. Brenna placed her smoke-stained palm in his and said that if the forge turned out to be bad, she would leave. The system flashed gold. Resident accepted. Brenna. Specialization. Blacksmith. Reward for the bearer. Strength +9. Dexterity +5. Branch unlocked. The Great Forge. Armory. Mechanical workshop. Cale poured 100 units into the Great Forge in a single motion. In the middle of the stone courtyard, a smithy rose up, featuring a forge fueled by the heat of deep crystals and requiring coal. The bellows swam on their own. The black metal anvil rang like a bell at the touch of a fingernail. Brenna stepped inside and froze. It was the second time in his life that Cale had seen a person touch a wall and not believe his own eyes. The first time had been with Astrid. Brenna turned to him, and her angry eyes were filled with tears mixed with delight. She said that even in Kaldheim, in the guild forge, there was no furnace like this. By evening, she was already forging. First, she reforged the tips for the tower lances, and the range of the shots increased by 1/3. Round watched her work from the corner of the forge like an apprentice. The old blacksmith, who had once kicked Cale out of his workshop, now begged the girl to take him on as an apprentice. The outpost was healing its wounds and growing. Sigrun had built an icy bastion above the gates. Leora had planted a second greenhouse, and the first greens appeared on the tables. Astrid had recruited 24 new recruits from among the refugees. The system summed up the week with a line that made Cale's heart skip a beat. The refuge had reached the rank of an underground city. The fourth level had been unlocked. The city structure's branch had been unlocked. Market, school, council hall. An award for the bearer, all stats plus 10. Kale stood in the new council hall behind a stone table, staring at his hands. These hands could now bend an iron rod into a knot. This mine held the entire city in its grasp, down to the last warehouse. And yet, less than 2 months had passed since that night when he'd been freezing in a snowdrift. He gathered his people around the table and told them that the peace would end soon. The gang had been crushed, but their leader was alive and had fled south to the middlemen. The cult roams the north and hasn't forgotten the empty pillar. Hargate depends on them, but Torvald is alive and sharpening his teeth. And most importantly, the city is growing and can no longer be hidden. Warmth amid the eternal winter shines across the entire plain like a bonfire in the night. He was wrong about only one thing, the timing. The peace didn't end in a week. It ended the very next morning. A sentry led a lone traveler to the gates. The traveler was neither a bandit, nor a refugee, nor a servant. Beneath his white traveling cloak, he wore finely crafted raven black chainmail. A silver bear adorned the buckle of his belt, the coat of arms of the kingdom of Nordmark, the last surviving kingdom of the north, whose capital, according to rumors, was frozen solid in the ice. The traveler identified himself as a royal scout of the distant guard. He let his gaze sweep over the tower's icy walls, the smoking greenhouse chimneys, and the well-fed people in the courtyard. His expression was that of a man who had spent a week doubting the reports but was now seeing everything with his eyes and is obliged to report. He said he had brought a message from Chancellor Nordmark. The kingdom wishes to know who the master of this place is, and the Chancellor invites the master to the capital. The scout paused and added the second half of the message. If the master refuses the invitation, the kingdom will be forced to consider the growing fortress on its ancestral lands a usurper, with all the consequences that entails. Kale looked at the silver bear and realized that the ranks of his enemies had just grown by an entire flight of stairs. Behind the scout lay a plain, and beyond the plain stood an entire freezing kingdom, hungry, armed, and very interested in a city where it's warm. Kale ordered that the scout be fed and given lodging, while he locked himself in the council chamber with his own people. The debate turned heated. Astrid said that an invitation accompanied by a threat was not an invitation at all, but a leash. She said that in the capitals of the north, guests like him were put in rooms of honor and then forgotten. No one remembered to let them out. Brenna suggested fortifying the walls and sending the Chancellor to the ice demons, because no army could take the city with its spears and Sigrun's bastions. Leora shook her head and reminded them of the numbers. According to old temple records, 200,000 people lived in Nordmark. Even the freezing kingdom would field 10,000 spears. No forge could withstand 10,000. Sigrun remained silent longer than anyone else, and then said quietly that she had seen the capital of Nordmark 2 years ago when she was fleeing through those lands. She said that the harbor there was frozen solid up to the masts of the ships, and that furniture from the palace was being burned in the squares. Kale listened to everyone and pieced the picture together. The kingdom could not afford a war. Troops cost food and there was no food. So the ultimatum was a bluff born of desperation. But the bluff of a desperate man is more dangerous than the calculation of a powerful one. A cornered beast lashes out. Kale announced his decision. He would go. But he would go not as a supplicant, but as a merchant. Nordmark needs what the city has, warmth and food. The city needs what Nordmark has, skilled workers, iron mines, and recognition that will lift the stigma of imposters from the city. He's going to sell winter to those who are drowning in it. Astrid declared that she was going with him, and her tone brooked no argument. Kale didn't argue. He left the city in the hands of 3 people. Sigrun guards the walls, Brenna forges, Leora keeps the people and the council in order. Before leaving, he spent 3 days using up his stored warmth. He raised the 4th and 5th towers. He deepened the 4th tier and laid the foundation for a granary. The system paid out regularly, and by the time he left, his strength was twice that of Astrid's best fighter. The journey to the capital took 6 days. A scout named Einar led them along the trade route, and Kale looked around. It was painful to look. The villages along the route lay dead. Rafters jutted out from under the snow like ribs. On the 3rd day, they came upon a village that was still alive, and they would have been better off not seeing it. The people there were eating bark and staring at passers-by with empty eyes. Kale left them a sack of dried meat. Einar watched this in silence, and that evening by the campfire, he said that in the capital people's throats were slit for a sack like that. The capital of Nordmark came into view from the pass as a gray mass by the frozen-over bay. The city was enormous, and the city was dying. Smoke rose from barely 1 in 10 chimneys. A line of carts carrying the dead stood at the gates. The guards on the walls were wrapped in rags over their chainmail. Kale rode down the main street and felt eyes watching him from the dark windows. That's how people in a starving household look at those who are well-fed. The Chancellor received them that very evening. His name was Halvdan. Kale had expected to see a haughty nobleman, but instead he saw an old man with a face as gray as ash who looked as though he hadn't slept in a week. The throne room was unheated. As it turned out, the king had been bedridden with a fever for a month, and the Chancellor and the council had been ruling the country. Halvdan began harshly. He said that the lands of the plateau had belonged to the crown for 800 years, and that a fortress without a royal charter constituted rebellion. He said that the crown had the right to crush the rebellion with iron. Kale listened without interrupting. Then he asked permission to show something and placed 3 objects on the table in front of the Chancellor: a fresh cucumber from Leora's greenhouse, a bar of steel from Brenna's forge, and a yellow heating crystal the size of an apple. He said the cucumber had been picked 5 days ago in the middle of winter, that no guild in the north possessed steel like this, and that the crystal would heat a room in this palace for a year without a single log. Then he stated the most important point. The city is ready to sell all of this to the crown in exchange for iron ore, skilled craftsmen, and a royal charter for the land. He offered the Chancellor a choice without humiliation. The crown could expend its last reserves on storming the impregnable walls and lose both the winter and its army. Or it could feed the capital from his greenhouses by spring and heat its homes with his crystals. Halvdan picked up a cucumber and held it in his palms for a long time. Kale could see the old man weighing his options. Then the Chancellor said something strange. He said he believed the numbers, but that numbers didn't decide everything. He said there were people on the council who stood to gain from a war with the fortress, and he named a name: Jarl Sigwald, commander of the southern regiments. For a month, Sigwald had been telling the council that a sorcerer and his gang had taken up position on the plateau, and that a campaign would shift all the misfortunes of winter onto the enemy. Halvdan said outright that at tomorrow's council meeting, Kale would have to outmaneuver Sigwald. Kale and Astrid spent the night in the guest wing. Astrid didn't sleep. She sat by the door with a sword on her lap. Toward morning, she woke Kale with a nudge. In the hallway, the floorboards creaked under the weight of many feet. Then someone slammed the door, and it flew off its hinges. Men in black without coats of arms poured through the opening. Astrid met the first one with her blade. Kale met the second with a fist, and the man flew into the wall and remained lying there. They fought in the darkness and cramped space. Kale moved like never before in his life. The system had pushed his body to its limits, and the hired thugs were no match for him. A minute later, 3 of them lay unconscious, and the last one was gasping for breath in Astrid's grip. The palace guards rushed in with torches drawn by the commotion, and striding behind the guards came a burly man in a wolf fur coat with a gold chain draped over it. Kale recognized him before he even introduced himself. "You don't mistake faces like that." The man in charge. Jarl Sigwald was shouting the loudest of all. He was pointing at the men on the ground and screaming that a sorcerer from the plateau had attacked the palace servants. Kale stood amid the chaos and understood the ingenuity of the trap. The dead mercenaries would have served as evidence against him. The living, however, served as evidence in his favor. He grabbed the one he'd knocked unconscious by the collar and ripped the pouch from his belt. Inside the pouch, nestled among the silver, lay a dog tag from the southern regiments. Kale raised the dog tag above his head and asked loudly, so that the entire corridor could hear, since when did palace servants wear the dog tags of the Jarl's regiments? The guards began to murmur. Sigwald flushed red and declared that the dog tag had been planted. The morning council turned into a trial. Halvdan clung to the opportunity like a drowning man to a log. The captured mercenary, under torture, did not hold back and named the treasurer of the southern regiments as his employer. The chain fell just 1 link short of reaching Sigwald himself. The Jarl left the hall formally exonerated but in essence destroyed. The council voted in favor of a treaty with the city on the plateau. Kale signed the charter and watched Sigwald across the hall. The Jarl returned his gaze, and his eyes promised a continuation. The charter granted the city a name and rights. From then on, it was known as the Free City of Warm Stone under the crown's authority, with the right to maintain walls, a garrison, and trade. The crown pledged to send ore and craftsmen. The city pledged to send crystals and to receive the royal representative. They set out on their return journey a day later. A convoy carrying the first shipment of ore trailed behind them, and people walked alongside the convoy. The chancellor granted the city 120 artisan families whom the capital could not support. Carpenters, masons, miners, a glassblower, and even a single watchmaker. Kale rode alongside the column, and the system hummed quietly in his head, boosting his authority with every mile they traveled. On the third day of the journey, Einar caught up with the column on a worn-out horse. The scout had ridden with them to the fork in the road, then turned toward the outpost, and now he was back. He didn't look happy. He said the outpost had received a messenger from the south. The messenger brought news from the border posts. A caravan flying the flag of the Gilder trading house had entered the kingdom via the southern pass. Kale shrugged and asked what was wrong with the merchants. Einar replied that the house of Gilder was a front. Everyone at the border knows whose money is behind it, the money of a southern middleman named Moruk, the very same man who has been buying up the north with live cargo for 20 years. And Moruk's caravan isn't carrying goods. The caravan is carrying mercenaries, 300 swordsmen trained in the southern style, and a man with a wolf's hook on his belt buckle was seen leading the caravan. The chieftain of a defeated bandit gang sold Moruk not what he had plundered, but a fairy tale about a city where warmth grows from stone, and Moruk came to buy that fairy tale in its entirety. Kale drove the column home without any rest days. The craftsmen's families grumbled but kept moving. As they approached the plateau, he saw his city from the pass and forgot about Moruk for a moment. Warm stone was visible from 10 miles away. A cloud of steam from the greenhouses hung over the cliff. The icy walls of Sigrun glowed blue in the sun. Smoke rose from the new chimneys. The city glowed amid the white, lifeless plain like a coal in the ashes. Kale looked on and understood the hidden meaning behind this beauty. A beacon like this draws more than just people. At home, a week's worth of news awaited him. Leora had taken in another 30 refugees and opened a school for the children because the idle kids were tearing the bunker apart stone by stone. Brenna and Hraven had forged the first set of lamellar armor. Sigrun had frozen a deep cold reservoir into the northern slope and admitted that she herself didn't fully understand this structure. The system described the reservoir only vaguely. A reservoir of elemental power for structures of the highest order. Kale convened a council and laid out everything about Moruk. 300 southern blades are not the same as 150 rabble. These are soldiers. Astrid spread a rough map on the table and said that the southerners wouldn't storm the walls like a gang. Southern tactics mean a siege. Block the trails, cut off Hargate from the city, and wait until patience runs out inside. Kale nodded and added a second layer. Moruk is a merchant. A merchant doesn't fight for an idea. He fights for his goods and walks away when the cost outweighs the profit. So the goal isn't to defeat 300 men. The goal is to make the siege ruinous. The city had been preparing for 8 days. Craftsmen's families from the capital had joined the effort, so Kale's head was spinning from the lines of buildings under construction. Miners struck an iron vein right beneath the 4th tier. A glassblower set up a workshop, and the greenhouses were fitted with double-pane windows. The system awarded bonuses for each workshop, and Kale caught himself no longer noticing the increases in strength. His body was already living at the limits of what was human, but his intellect was growing, and that growth felt strange and sweet. He held the entire city in his mind. Every warehouse, every guard shift, every sack of grain. Moruk arrived on the 9th day. He arrived in style. The caravan set up camp on the southern edge of the plateau with white tents, and a merchant's flag rose above them. No weapons were in sight. 3 riders with white ribbons, acting as negotiators. Kale stepped out onto the wall. Below, a heavy-set man sat on a shaggy horse clad in furs worth an entire village. His face was round and gentle, and his eyes smiled independently of the rest of his face. Moruk spoke in a voice as soft as fat. He said he heard much about the wondrous city and had come to trade. He offered a price for the heat crystals 3 times higher than the king's. Then he paused and proposed a second deal. He said he was willing to buy the secret itself, the method by which the city's master cultivates the stone and the heat. For the secret, he offered Kale's weight in gold and a position as a partner in the Southern Trading Empire. Kale replied politely that he traded crystals with the crown by charter, but the secret was not for sale because it was inseparable from his mind. Moruk nodded kindly. Then he made a third offer. He said that in that case he would wait until the price on Kale's head dropped. A merchant always knows how to wait, and he also mentioned, almost in passing, that the roads were dangerous these days and that the caravan would have to stay here for safety's sake. Maybe a month, maybe until spring. The siege began the next morning without a single arrow being fired. The Southerners blocked both trails with outposts. Patrols circled the plain. The very first wagon train from Hargate carrying fish was turned back. Then what Kale had been waiting for and fearing happened. People began to come to Morok. First, two disgruntled men from among the new refugees who had been caught stealing and expelled from the city. Then the headman of a distant village that had been bringing hides to the city. Morok bribed each one. He paid them in silver for stories about the city, about where the warehouses were, how many guards there were, that the city's lord was young and that he had no family to back him up. Leora brought this news from the market, where rumors swirled and her face grew gloomier with each passing day. She told Kale that Morok's iron couldn't be pierced, so he was testing the people instead. People are softer than iron. In the third week of the siege, Morok made a move that Kale privately called both rotten and brilliant. The Southerners stopped turning away the caravans from Hargate. They began buying them, right on the trail, at twice the city price. Silver up front. Hargate was shaken. Torval came alive and spoke on the steps, saying that the South pays with silver while the Rock pays with soup. That silver is eternal while soup is eaten up. The flow of resources into the city dried up by half within a week. The council proposed various solutions. Astrid suggested a night raid and impaling Morok's head on a spear. Kale forbade it. Killing a negotiator wearing a white sash would make the city a criminal in the eyes of the crown and give free rein to Sigvald, who was just waiting for an excuse in the capital. Brenna suggested buying Hargate back by raising prices. Kale did the math and refused. A financial war with Morok was like a mosquito fighting an elephant. He thought about it for 2 days. And he found a solution while looking at Leora's school blackboard, where the children were drawing houses with charcoal. He realized that Morok was fighting to ensure the city remained the only miracle. The only miracle can be besieged. 1,000 wonders cannot be besieged. Kale presented a plan to the council that made everyone's faces fall. He proposed giving up part of the secret, not the system itself. The system cannot be given away, but the fruits of the system can be replicated by hand. Brenna now knew the composition of the furnaces. The glass blower knew about double-paned windows. Leora knew the design of the beds beneath the crystals. All of this could be compiled into a simple, easy-to-understand lesson. And this lesson could be given to Hargate and the 3 neighboring villages. Furnaces that burn 10 times less fuel. Warm cellar greenhouses. Houses that retain heat for a full day. Astrid asked why they should feed those who sell them to the Southerners. Kale replied with a chain of reasoning. Villages that have their own heat don't depend on Morok's silver. Villages that don't depend on Morok trade with the city. And most importantly, Morok laid siege to the city because the city is a treasure chest. If the treasure is distributed across the entire plain, then besieging the chest loses its meaning. The city went out among the people. Brenna, along with Hraven and a dozen apprentices, traveled to Hargate to install new furnaces. Leora sent her students with seedlings. Kale lent Hargate grain until spring. Torvald tried to derail the work and shouted at the town meeting that the Rock was buying souls. The blacksmith Hraven responded to him. He stood up and said in front of everyone that he had lived in Warmstone for a month and that there work was paid for with warmth and bread, not words. And that if Torvald knew of a place where they paid better, let him show the way. The town meeting laughed. Thorvald's rule ended that day, not by the sword, but by laughter. A month later, the plain had changed. Plumes of smoke from new furnaces rose above Hargate. Villages sent caravans to the city, bypassing the southern outposts along the night trail at Sigrun had frozen solid through the marshes. Morok's mercenaries froze in their tents and burned their pay on firewood at extortionate prices. The siege was devouring Morok's money like a furnace devours straw. Kale saw from the watchtower how arguments by the campfires in the White Camp were growing more frequent. Morok requested negotiations at the end of the 7th week. He arrived at the gates with no trace of kindness left in his eyes. He said dryly that he was disbanding the caravan and heading south. He said he accepted the loss because he knew how to count. Then he leaned forward in the saddle and added one last thing quietly. He said he had lost in silver, but that in the north there was a power that did not count silver. He said that on the way here his men had seen white robes on the northern trails. Many robes. The black sun was gathering a large tax, and the priests in robes were questioning everyone they met about one thing, about the city of sorcerers and the white witch who freezes the walls. Morok smiled with just his lips as a farewell. He said that a merchant leaves when the fanatics arrive, because you can't even sell your own life to fanatics. The caravan set out within a day. Kale stood on the wall and watched as the white tents faded into the distance to the south. The victory was complete and left a bitter taste. He turned toward the north. The sky there hung heavy as a lid. That evening, Sigrun found him at the lookout post. She stood there silently for a long time, then said she was leaving. She said the cult was coming for her and that the city would pay for her with blood, just as all those who had given her blood had paid. Kale listened until the end. Then he asked if she remembered what she'd told him that night by the pillar when she'd asked why he was saving her. She remembered. He repeated those words, "I don't betray my own," and he added something new. "The city isn't the blood you found. The city is the walls you built with your own hands. You don't walk away from yourself." Sigrun looked at him in the darkness, and in her eyes the old ice of 10 years of persecution was melting. The system quietly chimed with a message about a resident's loyalty rising to its limit. And from the northern tower, a sentry was already shouting. Lights burned on the horizon in the night, not campfires. Torches. Hundreds of torches stretched in a chain across the entire plain. The black sun had not come to burn the witch. It had come to burn the city. By dawn, the chain of torches had turned into a crowd, and the crowd had gathered half a mile from the walls. Kale counted into the trumpet and lost count after 800. The cult had not brought warriors. The cult had brought the people. Frostbitten peasants with pitchforks. Women with children on their backs. Old men with icons of the black circle. And amid this sea, the white robes of the ministers, newably up to 100, stood out. At the front, a platform was being pulled by a sleigh, and on the platform stood a man Kale had never seen before. Tall. Skinny to the bone. Clad in white from head to toe. His face was as calm as that of a sleeper. Einar, the representative left behind by the crown near the city, looked through his spyglass and let out a long curse. He said that this was the supreme voice of the Black Sun himself, a man named Ansgar. 10 years ago, he was just a monk, and now half the north kisses the trail of his sleigh. Astrid asked how many fighters the cult had. Einar replied that that was the horror of it. There were almost no fighters. There are 1,000 frozen people to whom Ansgar promised that winter would end when the last sorcerer was burned. To shoot at such a crowd would be like shooting at one's own future. Word of a massacre would spread, and 5,000 would come in place of the 1,000. Kale looked at the platform and realized that all his former enemies had been simple. The gang wanted money. The Jarl wanted power. Morok wanted profit. You could negotiate with each of them in their own language. Ansgar wanted nothing that could be given. Ansgar wanted the world to burn properly. The cult did not attack. The cult began its service. The crowd formed a circle in the cold and began to sing. The singing swept over the city in waves, day and night. Between the chants, Ansgar spoke into a tin megaphone, and his voice carried to the city walls. He told the city that he wished no harm upon the people within. He said that winter was punishment for harboring corruption. He demanded one thing, to hand over the witch and the sorcerer who were moving the stone. Then everyone inside would receive forgiveness and a place by the pure fire. A siege by prayer proved more terrifying than a siege by silver. On the third day, rumors began to spread throughout the city. Kale heard them through Leora. New refugees whispered that perhaps they really should give them up. That two were not 40 nor 400. The mother of a sick child screamed in the market that everyone would die because of the witch. Fear crept through the tears like dampness. Astrid suggested going out at night in a small group to capture Ansgar alive. Einar waved his hands and said that a martyr in captivity was 10 times worse than a martyr at liberty. Brenna forged gloomily and suggested they simply wait it out. There's enough food in the city to last a year. Let them sing until they freeze to death. Leora looked up at her and said quietly that there were children out there in the crowd, and that when the crowd began to freeze and die beneath the walls of the warm city, every death would be laid at the city's door and that of its ruler. Ansgar knew this. Ansgar used the children as weapons. Kale hadn't slept for the second night in a row. He paced the council hall, breaking down the problem the way he'd once broken down hopeless projects. What was the enemy's goal? Not Sigrun. Sigrun was merely a symbol. Ansgar's target was the faith of the crowd. That faith hung by a single nail. Winter is a punishment, and every punishment has a culprit. To pull out that nail would bring it all crashing down. But how could one uproot the faith of 1,000 frozen people for whom it served as a substitute for bread? At dawn, he went down to the infirmary, where Leora was giving an infusion to a frostbitten from the crowd. The defector had fled toward the walls that night out of desperation. Kale sat down beside him and began asking not about the cult, but about his life. And the defector told his story. The village had died out. The children had died. His wife had died. Ansgar came and said that the pain was not in vain, that there was punishment and there was a path. And for the first time, the pain made sense. Kale listened, and inside him a decision took shape unlike any he made before. Ansgar trades in meaning amid meaninglessness. This trade can only be disrupted by another kind of meaning. Not with words. Thousands won't believe a word. With a deed that cannot be disputed. He went up to the council chamber and opened the Sigrun branch, that very line that had hung there misunderstood. A reservoir of deep cold. Structures of the highest circle. He scrolled further through the tree and found what the system revealed only when certain conditions were met. The conditions glowed green. City rank. The presence of an ice mage of utmost loyalty. A full reservoir. The structure had a simple name. Weather Spire. The description was 3 lines long. A facility for local weather control. Radius of 5 miles. Dispersal of cloud cover and mitigation of frost within the radius. Kale reread it 3 times. The system was offering him the chance to bring about within a single circle of land what the North had prayed for generations. A small thaw. The price was monstrous. 800 units of heat and the entire power of the reservoir at once. The city had been saving up 800 units for a month. He called Sigrun over and showed her the line. Sigrun read it, and her hands trembled. She said that her gift had only ever been able to take away heat. She asked if he understood what would happen if, right before his eyes, the witch they were demanding to burn were to melt the sky. Kale replied that he understood. That was exactly what would happen. They prepared in secret for a full day. Sigrun did not leave the reservoir. Brenna forged a core of ringing steel for the spike. Kale drained the entire city's supply into the structure, down to the very last unit, and when the counter hit 0, he felt a strange lightness, as if before a leap. On the 5th morning of the siege, the city opened its gates. The cult crowd roared and surged forward, awaiting their reward. Kale stepped out onto the wall above the gates, and Sigrun stood beside him dressed in white, without chains or an escort. The crowd roared upon recognizing the witch. Ansgar on the platform raised his hand, and the roar subsided. He shouted into the megaphone that the sorcerer had come to his senses, and that the pure fire was already ready. Kale responded to the entire plain with a voice that the system had long ago made louder than any megaphone. He said that Ansgar was promising the people an end to winter through the bonfire. He said that thousands of bonfires were burning in the north, yet winter remained as it was. And he said that now everyone would see how winter truly ends. He nodded to Sigrun. Sigrun closed her eyes and placed her palms on the core of the spire, which had risen overnight above the gate tower like a slender needle. The needle hummed. The hum rose into the sky, and the sky cracked. The leaden blanket of clouds that had always lain over the plain, as far back as the elders could remember, began to drift away from a point above the city. The sun burst through the gap. Not a pale speck behind a veil, but a real, fierce, brilliant sun, the likes of which none of those standing below had ever seen. Light poured over the plain for 5 miles in every direction. The air warmed before their very eyes. The first drop fell from the icy walls, and the tinkling of the drop in the deathly silence was louder than any bell. The crowd stood petrified. Then an ancient old woman in the front row fell to her knees, her face toward the sun. A second followed her. Then they fell by the hundreds. People wept with their faces raised to the sky. People caught the drops in their mouths. A mother lifted her child toward the light. Ansgar shouted from the platform that this was a delusion and a devilish illusion. His voice was drowned out. Standing against his words were the sun on their skin and the water on their lips, and there was no arguing with that. The crowd's faith sought a new nail, and the nail stood on the wall. It was not winter that had left the plain. The punishment ended where the city began. By noon, the besieging crowd had turned into a crowd of pilgrims at the gates. The people were not asking for forgiveness. The people were asking to be let in. Kale ordered the field kitchens near the walls to be open and the sick to be admitted to the infirmary. Leora and her students worked until nightfall. Cultists slipped out of the camp one by one, carrying their robes under their arms. Ansgar left at night with a handful of loyalists, heading north, and no one ran after him. The system produced a result Kale had never seen before. The Bearer's authority had reached its regional limit. The refuge is granted status. The unofficial capital of the north. The 5th tier has been opened. A branch has been opened. Roads, outlying settlements, vassal trees. That evening, Kale stood beneath a clear patch of sky and listened to the city. The city hummed of life across its 5 tiers. And in his pocket lay a letter that a crown messenger had brought that very morning, which he hadn't had time to open amid all the wonders. He broke the seal by the light of the spire. It was from Chancellor Halvdan. The handwriting was erratic. The Chancellor wrote that the king had died 9 days ago. That the heir was a 7-year-old boy. that the council was divided and that Jarl Sigvald had brought the southern regiments into the capital under the pretext of protecting the heir. The last line was short. The chancellor wrote that if Warmstone valued literacy and trade, then let its master pray to his stones. Because Sigvald had announced to the council that the first order of business for the new government would be to restore order to the crown lands. And everyone in the hall understood which lands were being referred to. Kale convened the council before midnight and read the letter aloud. A long silence followed the reading. Einar, as the representative of the crown, spoke first, his voice hoarse. He said that he had known Sigvald for 20 years. The Jarl is neither Moruk nor Ansgar. The Jarl represents 5,000 regular infantry from the southern regiments, siege engines, and the authority to speak on behalf of the crown. Against him, the city would not be defending itself, but would be in revolt. Astrid slammed her palm down on the table and said that the walls had not been taken by a gang, nor by a merchant, nor by a cult, and the Jarl would not take them either. Einar replied grimly that the walls would be taken without a battering ram. Sigvald will declare the city an outlaw territory. He'll cut off the royal highways. They'll strangle the trade that now feeds half the plain. And every merchant who brings ore into the city will become a criminal in the eyes of the crown. Kale listened and looked at the map of the north that Brenna had etched onto a copper sheet. The city, Hargate, villages, the capital by the frozen bay, and a long, thin road stretching between them. He thought about how all these victories had been defensive ones. He sat entrenched in stone, waiting for the enemy, while the enemy chose the time and the method that wouldn't work with Sigvald. With every month in power, Sigvald became more deeply entrenched. To wait was to let the enemy grow stronger. For the first time, the city didn't need to fight off an attack. The city had to attack. But attacking the crown would mean confirming Sigvald's claims of rebellion and losing everything the charter had granted. Kale mulled over the problem until morning, and in the morning he reframed it. Not to attack the crown, to save the crown. Sigvald's power rested on 3 pillars. His regiments, the divided council, and the heir was in his hands. The heir was the key. As long as the boy was with the Jarl spoke on behalf of the crown. If the boy were no longer with the Jarl would become merely a man with an army, and a man with an army without authority is a rebel. Kale laid out his plan to the council, to march on the capital with a small detachment, rescue the heir and the chancellor, bring them to Warmstone and declare that the rightful crown is under the protection of the free city until the king comes of age. Then Sigvald would be branded a rebel before the entire north. Einar listened, turning pale. Then he said that it was madness, and that it was the only plan that could work. He added a third point. Without him, they wouldn't even make it past the gates. He knows the palace from his time serving in the guard. They assembled a detachment in 2 days. Kale, Astrid, Einar, Sigrun, and 10 of Astrid's best apprentices. The city was left in the care of Leora and Brenna, with orders to guard the gates and not to trust any letters without the secret mark. Before they set out, Brenna gave each of them a piece of work from her forge. To Kale, she gave a blade she had been working on for a month. It looked simple, gray, unadorned. She said the metal was taken from the heart of a fallen star that miners had found in a vein, and that there was no other like it in the north. The blade cut through a forged plate like bread. They traveled at night along Sigrun's night trail through the marshes, then along the highway disguised as a caravan carrying crystals. The crystals serve as a better pass than any document. The guards at the checkpoints gazed at the warmth with hungry eyes and avoided looking at their faces. The capital received them worse than last time. Southern regiments stood in the squares. A gallows had been erected near the palace, and on it Kale saw 2 men in the uniforms of the old palace guard. Sigvald was purging the capital of those loyal to the chancellor. Arrests were taking place throughout the city. Einar led them to an inn to meet his contact, who explained the situation. Chancellor Halden was under house arrest in his own wing of the palace. The heir was in the northern tower, guarded by southerners. In 4 days, Sigvald would convene a grand council where he would proclaim himself Lord Protector until the king came of age. After that, his power would become legitimate, and it would be too late to touch him. 4 days. Kale planned the operation just as he had once planned the impossible completion of projects. Break it down into parts. Each part had its own time and its own person. On the night before the council, the city got festively drunk because Sigvald had rolled out barrels to the regiments in celebration of tomorrow's grandeur. That too was part of the plan. The squad had spread the rumor about the barrels through bride market vendors 2 days ahead of schedule. They set out after midnight in 3 groups. Einar, with 2 fighters, went through the drain of the old bathhouse into the chancellor's wing. Astrid, with 6, headed for the wall of the North Tower. Kale, with Sigrun and 2 others, went through the main gate because someone had to make a commotion when the time came. They reached the tower without incident. Astrid took out 2 sentries on the wall so that they fell without a sound. Inside the tower, a problem awaited that no one had anticipated. Standing at the heir's door was not a drunken guard. There were 6 sober men in black, without insignia, and commanding them was a man Einar would have recognized immediately, the chief of Sigvald's personal hunters, nicknamed Hort, a man about whom it was said at the border that he slaughtered sleeping men more cleanly than a cook butchers a bird. The fight in the tower turned vicious and close quarters. Astrid tied Hort to herself, and the corridor filled with the clang of metal. 2 of her fighters fell on the stairs. Kale heard the clanging from the courtyard and realized that the plan had fallen apart and that it was time to make some noise. He ordered Sigrun to sound the alarm in her own way. Sigrun froze the palace courtyard into a mirror and raised an icy pillar above it, burning blue all the way to the rooftops. Half the palace awoke and rushed out to witness the omen. Amid the commotion, Kale cut his way into the tower. He moved through the southerners as if through reeds, and Brenna's grey blades sang. At the heir's door, he stood shoulder to shoulder with Astrid against Hort. Hort fought like no one Kale had ever faced in this world. But Kale had been forged by the system from 50 rewards, and in the end, the grey blade found an opening. Hort collapsed by the door he had been guarding. The boy was carried out wrapped in a cloak. The 7-year-old king did not cry. He asked only if they would take him away from his uncle Sigvald, and upon hearing yes, he clung silently and tightly to Kale's neck. Silently and tightly. Einar and the Chancellor were already waiting in the courtyard. Halvin had wasted away to half his former size during his month of imprisonment, but his eyes were still alive. They left through the bathhouse drain amid the howling of alarm behind them. Outside the city, a sleigh and the night trail awaited them. The pursuit was hot on their heels by dawn. Sigvald set mounted hunters after them, and the horsemen rode along the highway faster than the sleigh. Then Sigrun her power to the very end. She brought down snow cornices from the roadside cliffs behind the sleigh for a mile, and the road was impassable to the horsemen for a week. They reached the city on the 6th day, half dead from the chase, and the city was already buzzing. The news had overtaken them, carried by Einar's messenger bird. People stood on the walls, and when the sleigh carrying the boy king entered the gates, warm stone roared so loudly that droplets rained down from the icy walls. Halvin did not rest. The old man demanded a quill and paper, and in the council hall dictated a manifesto. The Chancellor and the rightful king declared Jarl Sigvald a rebel who had seized the capital. The crown is temporarily residing in the free city of Tepli-Kamen, under the protection of its walls. All loyal subjects swear their oaths here. The manifesto was carried by birds to all corners of the north, the system responding with a line that Kale read 3 times. The refuge shelters the kingdom's legitimate authority. Status elevated. Residence of the crown. Government buildings accessible. Mint. Hall of Oaths. Throne room. Kale stared at the word throne and felt history shifting beneath his feet. 2 months ago, he had been freezing in a snowdrift, just another mouth to feed. Now a king lived in his city. The first days after the manifesto were like a flood. People were streaming toward the gates, the retinues of minor jarls loyal to the old oath, merchants who had fled the capital, artisans, and ordinary families. The city administered the oath of allegiance at the hall that Kale had erected overnight, and the population had surpassed 2,000. And on the 10th day, Sigvald's reply arrived. The reply was delivered by a messenger wearing a white sash, and it was not a letter, but a box. Inside the box, resting on straw, lay the severed head of Einar from the inn, and a 3-line note. Sigvald wrote that he would not tolerate this farce involving the stolen child, that in the spring, when the roads were passable, he would come with all his regiments and tear the warm anthill apart, stone by stone, and that the city had 1 winter left to say goodbye to life. Einar stood over the box, his face dark with anger. Kale placed a hand on his shoulder and turned to his men. He said that the Jarl had honestly set a deadline. Spring. That meant the city had all winter to achieve the impossible. In a single winter, the city had to become stronger than the royal army. The winter of preparation began with a head count. Kale shut himself away with the council for 2 days, and they tallied everything honestly. By spring, Sigvald would have up to 6,000 infantry, 1,000 cavalry, and a siege train with battering rams of southern design. The city had 400 fighters, half of whom were former peasants. The difference wasn't in numbers. The difference was that the regiments knew how to fight in formation, while the city knew only how to hold its ground on the walls. Astrid stated bluntly that over the winter she would turn the 400 into a garrison, but she wouldn't turn them into an army. An army takes years to build. Kale replied that an army takes years to build if you fight like Sigwald. But the city would fight like a city, not formation against formation, but with its entire being. Every tower, every smithy, every tier. And you mapped out the winter, just as he had once mapped out the greatest project of his past life. 3 directions: iron, people, and alliances. Brenna took charge of iron. Kale funneled everything the city earned into the blacksmithing branch, and the branch flourished. The mechanical workshop produced its first machines. Brenna, together with a clockmaker from among the capital's craftsmen, assembled a machine gun that fired a forged bolt 400 paces and reloaded via a crank twice as fast as the southern machines. Then they built a second one, and by midwinter the workshop was producing 1 machine a week. Craven cast bolts for them just as he had once cast horseshoes. Sigrun froze ice stakes and wolf pits into the approaches to the plateau for a mile around. Kale reinforced the weather spire with his second core, and the thaw circle expanded to 7 miles. Inside the circle, they were now plowing. This was the second front, the people. Kale realized a simple truth while tallying the supplies. A war is won not by the one who strikes hardest, but by the one who holds out the longest. A city with full granaries is invincible. A city with empty granaries will fall without an assault. The spire's thaw made the impossible possible. Winter crops in the midst of eternal winter. Leora, together with an agronomist from among the refugees, cultivated the first open-air fields in the north in 40 years. When greenery began to sprout from the black earth, people flocked to the fields to witness the miracle, and the elders wept as they knelt by the furrows. The swearing-in ceremony at the chamber lasted all winter. By midwinter, the city had 800 fighters. By the end, 1,200. Astrid drove them from dawn till dusk, and every single one passed through her hands. She divided the army not into regiments, but into hundreds, each assigned to sections of the walls and the underground passages. Each hundred knew its stone by heart. Kale took charge of the third front, alliances. The Chancellor's manifesto granted him the right to speak on behalf of the crown, and Kale spoke. Over the winter, he traveled through 8 neighboring jarldoms. He carried with him not gold, but crystals, grain, and stove makers. He offered each jarl something impossible to refuse in winter: warmth now and trade forever, in exchange for an oath of allegiance to the young king and a retinue by spring. 5 jarls swore allegiance immediately. 2 hesitated. The 8th, named Gunnar Black Hole, listened politely, accepted the gifts, and a week later Einar intercepted his to Sigvald. Gunnar had been selling the jarl information about the city and Kale's routes. The council demanded exemplary punishment. Kale did otherwise. He visited Gunnar without his retinue, accompanied only by Einar. He placed the intercepted letter on the table and laid a trade agreement beside it. He said that Gunnar could choose either document. According to the first, he would be hanged either by the crown in the spring or by Sigvald, who uses traitors and hangs them afterward. Under the second, his children would have bread to eat all year round. Gunnar sat poring over the papers for a long time. He chose the contract. Kale knew he could not be trusted and therefore established a garrison on his lands under the guise of a trading post. A traitor under surveillance is more useful than one who has been executed. By the end of winter, Kale stood on the 5th level above a model of the city that the carpenters had carved and did not recognize his own domain. 7 levels deep, 4 rings of walls, 30 towers with crossbow emplacements, fields and herds within the circle of the thaw. A population of 5,000, 1,200 of his own fighters, plus the promised jarl's retinues totaling another 800. The mint was striking the first northern coin featuring a bear and the sun. The system had awarded so many rewards over the winter that Kale halted further investments in the body. His power had reached the limit that the system called the human threshold, and it stated that beyond that lay a different path requiring a specific condition. The condition was not disclosed. He left this mystery to be solved after the war. Spring arrived early, and it did not come alone. The first report arrived from the southern outpost. Sigwald's regiments had marched out of the capital, 6,200 infantry, 900 cavalry, and 40 supply wagons stretching for 3 miles. The jarl advanced slowly and deliberately as rulers do. Along the way, he burned down 2 jarldoms that had sworn allegiance to the crown to set an example for the rest. Refugees from those regions reached the city with frostbitten children and tales of whose knuckles were white against the spears of the guards. Next came something no one had expected, from the north. The night patrol on the trail brought in a man barely alive. The man was from Ansgar's retinue. the very same gaunt servant who had held the trumpet during the high call. He asked for an audience with the city's lord and swore that the matter was more important than his own life. Kale received him in the presence of Leora and Einar. The servant told them the following. After the defeat at the city walls, Ansgar did not break but went further north beyond the dead passes, to a place where not even hunters venture. He led his last loyal followers to seek the source of eternal winter, to prove to the world that the curse is real. And they found it. The servant spoke, trembling, not from the cold. Beyond the passes, a city stands in the ice. Not human. As old as the ice itself. Towers of black ice reaching to the sky. And in the heart of the city, something sleeps and breathes. With every exhalation of that which sleeps, winter in the north grows a year longer. Ansgar descended to the heart with 20 loyal followers. Only the servant returned because he fled halfway there. The last thing he heard from the depths was Ansgar's voice. The supreme voice was shouting that he had found the true black sun and that now he would awaken it to purify the entire world. Einar asked cautiously whether the servant himself believed what he was saying. The servant looked up and said that one need not believe the words. You can look at the sky to the north. Kale climbed up to the lookout platform with his telescope. The northern horizon had changed overnight. Where a smooth white mist had always hung, a glow now loomed. Not red like a fire, black-purple, like a bruise in the sky. And it was slowly growing. The system had remained silent about the South and Sigwald's regiments, but regarding the glow, it responded on its own without being prompted for the first time ever. A line hung before Kale's eyes and would not fade. Source of the anomalous winter detected. Classification: Ancient elemental entity. Status: Awakening initiated from outside. Estimated time until full awakening: 40 days. Warning to the host: no refuge of any rank will survive the entity's full awakening. And on the second line below, the system added something that made Kale's jaw clench. Until the enemy army approaches from the south at its current marching speed, 12 days. He stood between two numbers, 12 and 40. A war that cannot be lost and a winter that cannot be weathered. For the first time since that night in the snowdrift, the mission wasn't falling into place. A hand rested on his shoulder. Astrid stood beside him and looked at the black glow. She said calmly that she could see both members on his face, and she said one more thing. Whatever he decided, the city would follow him. They had all followed him from the very beginning, not because he built walls, but because he had never once built them just for himself. Kale looked back and forth between the north and the south, and inside him, out of the chaos, the framework of the craziest plan of both his lives was slowly taking shape. To make it to the north in time, he had to remove the south from the board, not defeat it in 12 days. Remove it. And only one thing removes an army from the board: the loss of the very thing for which it is fighting. Sigwald is not marching for the city. Sigwald is marching for power. So the strike must not be against the army. The strike must be against Sigwald's power. Kale descended into the council chamber with the stride of a man who could once again see the entire board. He ordered everyone to be summoned, and he also ordered that it not be the army that be prepared for the journey. He ordered that feathers, paper, the mint, and Einar's finest birds be prepared. The war for the north will not begin with iron. It will begin with a letter that every soldier in Sigwald's regiments will read. Kale's plan was based on a single observation from a past life. Any structure collapses not from the outside but from within when the people inside cease to believe in its purpose. Sigwald's regiments were marching north not for the Jarl. The soldiers were marching for their pay and out of fear of the gallows. So the letter had to strike at both points. Kale spent a full day writing it and rewrote it 8 times. The letter turned out to be short. At the top was the royal seal and the signature of the 7-year-old king, written in a careful child's hand. Below were the chancellor's words. The crown declared that every soldier of the southern regiments who laid down his arms before the battle would receive a full pardon in the king's name. In addition, the crown promised each soldier something that Sigwald could not: a plot of land within the Thaw Circle, a warm home, and bread all year round. The crown took the soldiers' families under its protection against the Jarl's vengeance. And at the very bottom was a line that Kale had added last. Any soldier who brought a vehicle or a wagon train with him would receive a double allotment. The mint printed 4,000 copies of the letter. Next, Einar's birds, the night trail, and the hired merchants traveling with Sigvald's wagon train took over. Over the course of 3 nights, the letters found their way into the soldiers' campfires, into sacks of grain, into their boots, and under their saddles. And on the 4th night, Sigrun worked her magic over the regiment's encampments. She followed the night trail toward the highway and raised icy pillars along the road the regiments were traveling on. In each pillar, a frozen sheet of paper was visible like a fly in amber. The soldiers broke the letters out of the ice in formation. Sigvald responded as best he could. He hanged 4 men with letters tucked into their cloaks. The gallows backfired on him. Murmurs spread through the regiments that the Jarl was hanging his own men for reading the king's message. Desertions began on the 6th day. First, a few stragglers, then dozens. Over the course of a week, 400 people made their way to Gunnar Blackgap's outpost, which Kale had designated in advance as the reception point for defectors. Gunnar took them in, fed them, and sent lists to the city. His face in that moment was that of a man who had finally backed the right horse. On the 9th day, what Kale had silently hoped for happened. That night, an entire company of mechanized troops broke ranks and took 12 siege engines with them. The company was commanded by a gray-haired centurion named Dagfinn. He brought the machines to the city, handed them over at the gates, and told Kale, looking him straight in the eye, that he had served the crown for 30 years, not some fat jarl, and that half the men in the regiments were like him. It was just that half of them were afraid to take the first step. Sigvald reached the plateau on the 13th day instead of the 12th. He arrived with 4,000 men instead of 6,000, without a third of his chariots, with an army that was looking over its shoulder. Kale watched from the wall as the regiments deployed and realized that he had already won the first battle with his letter. But Sigvald remained Sigvald. The Jarl made the final move of a strong leader. He did not lay siege. He lined up his regiments for an immediate assault on the march so as not to give the army a night to reconsider. And he rode out in front of the formation himself and bellowed a speech. Einar listened through a lip-reading tube and relayed the message. The Jarl promised the regiments 3 days to plunder the city. Women, gold, and storehouses. Greed versus fear. An old trick. The assault began at noon. 4,000 men charged the walls in 3 waves, covered by the remaining siege engines. Sigvald's siege engines took up positions within firing range, and it soon became clear that the range had changed. Brenna's crossbows could hit 100 paces farther. 30 turrets fired as one, and within the first hour of battle, they reduced the Jarl's siege fleet to splinters. After that, the infantry advanced across the field with no cover. Icy potholes disrupted their formation. Wolf pits swallowed dozens. The thawing ground had turned to slush, and the southerners' boots sank into the mud of the north. Barely 1,000 reached the walls, where they were met by boiling stones and the Jarl's men striking from secret passages in the Lang. By sunset, it was all over. Sigvald's regiments did not retreat. They fell apart. Soldiers threw down their weapons by the hundreds and sank into the mud, raising their hands and clutching the king's letters as if they were passes. Sigvald, with his personal 100 horsemen, broke out of the meat grinder and fled south. Astrid asked to give chase. Kale forbade it, for the 2nd time in his life, holding her by the shoulder. He said they had no time for the Jarl. They had 26 days and a black glow in the north that had doubled in size during the assault. There were 2,500 prisoners. Kale went out to them on the field himself. He said that the crown keeps its word. Forgiveness, land, and bread await everyone. But first he told them the truth about the north, about the creature beneath the ice, about the 40 days of which 26 remained. And he said that he was not ordering anyone to go over the mountain passes because one cannot be ordered there. One can only be invited there. The city had been preparing for the northern campaign for 6 days. For his victory over the army, the system awarded Kale so much that his authority meter changed color, and the line he had been waiting for since winter appeared. The special condition for a different path has been revealed. The threshold is exceeded by a bearer whose refuge is voluntarily recognized as home by more than 5,000 souls. The condition has been met. The transformation is available. The bearer can become the anchor of the sanctuary. Kale read the description of the transformation in private and sat in silence for a long time. The anchor gained power beyond human limits. The anchor could draw power directly from all structures, but the anchor was bound to the sanctuary forever. To stray more than 50 miles from the city meant certain death. The price was eternal bondage. Kale closed the text without making a decision. It was 40 miles to the mountain passes. According to the servant, it was another 60 miles to the Black City beyond them. The anchor wouldn't make it there alive. He had to postpone the decision, and this delay left a thorn in his side. They set out on the 7th day. Kale took the 200 best men. Astrid went with the veterans. Sigrun, without whom there was Brenna with the disassemblable machines on the sleds. Leoru with the field infirmary, because she's shown up at the assembly gate with a bag and not even Kale dared argue with her. The city was left in the hands of Chancellor Einar and Dagfinn, along with the garrison. The boy king came out to see the column off from the wall and shouted down from above that he was ordering everyone to return. The column headed north, and with every mile the world changed. The thaw was left behind. And the last hunting grounds came to an end. Then began the lands where there were no tracks. None at all. The snow lay untouched as on the first day of creation and rang like glass beneath their feet. The sky ahead was filling with a lilac blackness, and flashes of light moved through that blackness at night. On the 5th day, at the foot of the mountain passes, Sigrun stopped in the middle of the crossing and took off her mitten. She caught a falling snowflake in her palm, raised it to her eyes, and called out to Kale in a voice that made the column come to a halt of its own accord. The snowflake in her palm did not melt. The snowflake was black. Sigrun said quietly that the ice had been speaking to her gift her whole life. But this ice was not silent like ordinary ice. This ice sings. And the song grows louder with every step toward the pass. And then she said the most important thing. She said she recognized the voice. That same cold had lived in her blood since birth. Her gift and what lay dormant beyond the passes were of the same essence. And that meant either her gift would be amplified 100-fold there, or what lay dormant would call her by name. The mountain passes greeted the party with a wind that never changed direction. The wind blew from the north, steady and constant as a breath. Leora was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. It was, in fact, a breath. The world around them was exhaling winter from a single point, and they were walking toward that point. At the pass, they found Ansgar's tracks, a frozen camp. 8 bodies sitting in a circle around a dead fire. These people hadn't frozen to death on the road. They had sat down in a circle and let the cold take them. Every face bore the same expression of quiet joy. Leora examined the bodies and said that death had come to them from within. They had stopped trying to keep warm of their own accord. Astrid asked why. Ansgar's servant, whom they had taken as a guide, answered. Trembling, he said that the supreme voice had taught them a new truth during their last stops. The cold is not a punishment. The cold is a call. And whoever answers the call will become part of purity. Kale ordered the 8 to be buried in the snow and the night watches to be doubled. The order proved prophetic. On the 2nd night beyond the pass, a veteran sentry from Astrid's group rose from his post, removed his helmet, unfastened his sheepskin coat, and set off walked northward, smiling. They caught up with him 100 paces away, restrained him, and he struggled in his comrade's grasp, screaming that he had been called by name and that it was warm there. Leora kept him hydrated until morning with hot herbal tea and burned bundles of bitter grass near his face. By dawn, the call had let him go. The veteran wept and could not remember his own name for half the day. From that night on, Leora established order. No one walks alone. Everyone sleeps in a circle around the heating crystals. Every evening, she gave the squad a decoction that burned their throats and drowned out the song of the ice. Sigrun didn't drink the decoction. She said she needed to hear the song. The song was a map. Guided by the song, she led the squad through the gorges to where the voice was louder. Kale walked beside her and saw how she was changing. Sigrun's eyes grew lighter with each passing day until they were the color of the sky at high altitude. Frost settled in patterns on her cloak and did not melt by the campfire. During rest stops, she sat apart and listened to what no one else could hear. The Black City appeared suddenly on the 11th day of their journey. The party climbed to the ridge, and down below, in a basin half the size of Nordmark, stood something the servant could not describe in words. Towers of black ice soared into the lilac sky to a height the eye could not fathom. Between the towers lay streets as wide as a river. Bridges hung in the air without support, and none of it was built for humans. The proportions were alien. Doors 100 staves wide, steps half a stature high. The city had been built by creatures for whom a human was as small as a mouse is to a human. Brenna looked down and whispered that such combinations of stone and ice couldn't exist because the loads wouldn't align. The city defied everything she knew about materials. The system responded to the city with a long string of text. Pre-winter era complex detected. Classification: shelter of another host. Status: host absent. Core occupied by an alien entity. Kale reread the message, and a chill ran down his spine, one that had nothing to do with the cold. A refuge for another host. So the system wasn't alone. That meant that long ago, someone like him had built a home here. And something had burrowed into the heart of that home and still slept there, exhaling winter. It took 2 days to reach the core through the dead city. The streets wound downward in a gigantic spiral. The deeper they went, the louder the song became. Everyone could hear it now, even through Leora's potion. The song wasn't frightening. That was the horror of it. The song made a promise, a different one for everyone. Kale caught himself hearing in it a voice from a past life, one he'd never heard in reality. The voice said he no longer had to carry everything on his own. At the end of the second day, the spiral led them into the hall at the core. The chamber was circular, a mile in diameter. The vaulted ceiling vanished into the darkness, and in the center of the chamber, suspended in ice as transparent as a tear, it hung. The entity had no form that the eye could grasp. The gaze slipped away. What remained was an impression: immense size, slowness, breath. And around the frozen heart, black veins radiated out across the ice, pulsing in unison. At the foot of the ice block burned the only living fire in the entire dead city, a bonfire. Ansgar sat by the bonfire. The supreme voice had aged 20 years in the space of a few months. All that remained of him was a shadow covered in skin. But his eyes were alive and they were happy. Around him on the ice, lines of a vast pattern were laid out in black crystals, converging on the heart of being. Ansgar was not surprised by the guests. He said that a song had warned him as early as yesterday. He stood up and began to speak, and his voice echoed through the lifeless hall like a sermon in a public square. He said that he had sought punishment, but found the truth. The world had long since rotted away. War, slavery, famine, lies. Winter is not a punishment. Winter is a cure. The Great Sleeper had been purifying the world slowly and mercifully, granting a reprieve. But people did not understand that mercy. So the reprieve is ended. The pattern is almost complete. In 9 days it will close the lines and the sleeper will awaken fully. And there will be only pure silence forever. Kale listened and grasped the horror of it all. It was impossible to reason with Ansgar because Ansgar had nothing left to desire. He had already received everything. Astrid took the simpler path. She darted toward the old man across the ice faster than thought, and she was flung back by an invisible wall 10 paces from the bonfire. Black veins beneath her feet flared. Figures rose from the ice surrounding the pattern. 20 of them. Icy statues of people in robes. Ansgar's loyal followers who had descended with him and answered the call. Now they were part of the pattern. They moved as if alive, only more slowly, and the stone froze at their touch. The squad engaged the enemy at the entrance to the hall. Brenna's crossbow bolts pierced the statues, but the statues healed themselves. The blades got stuck. The icy fingers of 2 veterans reached through the armor, and Leora barely managed to warm them from the crystals at the brink of death. They retreated to the upper gallery, and the statues did not pursue them. They could not stray from the pattern. Ansgar called after them from below, almost affectionately, saying he held no grudge. In 9 days, they would all become silenced together, and there would be no more disputes. The War Council gathered in the gallery by the fire. The situation was bleak. There was no way around it. The guards are invulnerable as long as the pattern stands. The pattern feeds on the essence, and the essence awakens from the pattern. A circle. Brenna suggested using machinery to bring down the hall's vaulted ceiling. Sigrun shook her head. The city's ice wouldn't break. It sang and fused together. Leora asked quietly if it was possible to lull to sleep that which was being awakened, to extinguish not the essence, but the awakening. And everyone looked at Sigrun because the question was directed at her. Sigrun was silent for a long time, gazing down at the lilac glow of the heart. Then she spoke what she had apparently carried within her since the very mountain passes. Her gift and the sleeper were of the same kind. The song did not call her as a sacrifice. The song called her as one of its own. She could pass through the guardians and through the wall of the pattern because she was no stranger to the pattern. She could reach the very heart, and there from within she could reverse the pattern of Ansgar, turn the lines of awakening into lines of sleep. She knew how to do it. The song itself revealed its structure to her. Kale asked about the price because he had learned to hear what was left unsaid. Sigrun looked at him directly with her high-set eyes and replied calmly, "To hold the pattern's reversal in place, an anchor is needed within. A living frost that will remain in the heart and sing a lullaby to the sleeper, forever." She said that this is not death. Whether it is worse or better than death, she does not know. She would become part of the ice, like the statues below, but only of her own free will and with a clear mind. The city would receive its eternal winter, locked into a single point, and she would receive eternity at that point. A silence hummed in the gallery in which the breath of the entity could be heard. Then Kale said one word: "No." Sigrun began to say that there was no other way. Kale repeated, "No," and stood up. He said that he hadn't dragged each of them out of the snow, the cage, and the bonfire just to pay with one of his own as if they were coins. He said they had 9 days, and that 9 days was an enormous amount of time for someone who had once built a house in a bare rock face in a single night. He didn't know how yet, but he knew where to look. The answer didn't lie in the hall below. The answer lay in a line from the system that he was rereading more and more often. The refuge of another carrier. Carrier absent. This city once had a master, and for some reason, that master let winter into his own heart. Until you understand how the house was broken, you won't understand how to fix it. Kale ordered them to set up camp and begin the search at dawn. He ordered them to look not for weapons or passageways. They were to search for memories, any traces of those who built it. They began the search at dawn, splitting into groups of 4. The dead city was enormous and its state of desolation was uneven. Closer to the core, everything had frozen solid, but on the upper tiers of the spiral they came across rooms where the black ice had receded. Brenna was the first to grasp the pattern and explain it to the others. The ice had left untouched the rooms bearing traces of the system's structures. It flowed around them like water flows around fat, so they had to search within those bubbles. By noon on the second day, Astrid's group of 4 found the main thing, a hall on the middle tier the size of Nordmark's throne room. Man-sized doors stood amid gigantic streets. Inside, the furniture was human-sized, and the walls were entirely covered in carvings, not decoration. A record. Kale stepped inside, and the system flashed so brightly that he squinted. Archive of the previous host detected. Synchronization available. Begin reading. He sat down in the middle of the hall on the frozen floor, placed his palms on the carvings and said, yes. Reading it was like another person's live life being channeled through him in a single night. The host's name was one that could not be pronounced by a human mouth, and the system translated it simply, Builder. He had lived in the era before winter, when the north was green. He was like Kale, a stranger from a dead world who had received the system at the hour of his death. He had built this city for 1,000 years, and the city was a miracle. 1 million inhabitants, towers reaching to the sky. The builder grew alongside the refuge until he reached the same threshold as Kale. And the builder underwent the transformation of the anchor. From there on, the recording became heavy. The anchor received the power of a god and an eternal bond. Century after century, he held the city, and the city needed nothing more. And in that lay the seed of its end. The city no longer needed people. The structures did everything. The inhabitants, once builders, became residents. From residents, they became guests. Then the population began to leave for the south because a person needs to feel needed, and the city no longer needed anyone. The builder remained with the emptying wonder and could not follow them. The tether held him fast. The anchor's solitude lasted 300 years, and then the builder did what the carvings had foretold in words as cold as ice. He decided that the warmth of his home was being wasted and that the very winter of the world was unjust. He conceived the construction of the final circle, the heart of the hearth. An entity of pure warmth that would warm the entire north forever, without people and without work. He imbued it with the power of a 1,000-year-old city and his own soul of the anchor as its core. The construction was a success and the construction was a mistake. The entity turned out to be alive and turned out to be inverted. Heat for all meant heat from nowhere. The entity did not radiate heat, it drew it in. From everywhere. Forever. A hungry heart. The builder realized his mistake when the north began to grow cold. He tried to dismantle the entity but could not because he himself was its core. Then, with a final effort of will, he did the only thing left to do. He put the entity to sleep along with himself, locking it away in the core of his own refuge and leaving the archive for whoever might one day come with the same system. The last line of the archive was an appeal. The builder wrote to his heir, "The entity cannot be killed because it contains the soul of the anchor, and the anchor is immortal as long as the refuge stands. The entity cannot be abandoned because even in sleep it drinks the world drop by drop. There is a third way which the builder himself discovered too late. The essence can be rebuilt. Any carrier's system is capable of reprocessing structures into new ones, provided there is sufficient power and the carrier possesses the core. A hungry heart can be reforged back into a hearth, a true one, a giving one. To do this, the heir must do 3 things. Take control of the core of the dead sanctuary by merging his system with the remnants of the old one. Infuse the reforging with power comparable to that invested in the essence. And give the new structure a new core in place of the builder's soul. A living will that agrees to become the heart of the hearth." Kale tore his palms away from the wall at dawn and sat for a long time, staring at a single point. Then he gathered everyone and recounted what he heard. The silence that followed was long. Leora was the first to speak, and her voice trembled. She said that the third path was the same as Sigrun's, only turned inside out. Once again, someone was needed to lie within the heart, only not in an icy one, but in a warm one. The price hadn't changed, only the color of the price had. Sigrun said calmly that she agreed and that a warm eternity sounded better than an icy one. Kale raised his hand and stopped everyone. He said that there was a word in the archive that everyone had overlooked. Will. Not the body, not the person. A living will willing to become the heart. The builder had poured his soul into it because he was alone, and there was no other will nearby. But Kale had something the builder didn't have. For the first time ever, he unfolded his system before them in its entirety, and he showed them the anchor transformation sequence that had remained unaccepted ever since the victory over Sigwald. His plan was madness cubed, and he laid it out step by step. He would undergo the anchor transformation here, merging his system with the core of the dead city. The anchor's tether would not be to warm stone but to this refuge, because the anchor binds to whichever core one possesses at the moment of choice. The power for the reforging would come from two sources at once: the reservoirs of this city, which had been accumulating cold for 1,000 years, and everything warm stone had amassed. And the core would not be a human. He himself will become the core, but not entirely. The anchor system allows what a mortal body does not, the division of will. Part of him will remain here forever as the heart of the new hearth, and part of him will remain human. He did not know which part would be which. The archive had honestly warned that the division was unpredictable. It might turn out that almost everything would remain human. It might turn out that almost nothing would. A terrible argument broke out. Astrid said she hadn't followed him all the way from the rift just to bring home half of him. Brenna asked grimly who would decide which half of her friend would continue to walk. Leora remained silent, looking at him with the eyes of a doctor who knows the patient is right. Sigrun said quietly that it should be her and that her kind was closer. Kale answered everyone at once with a single argument. The essence is made from the soul of the anchor. Only an equal can reforge it. Another anchor. Sigrun, despite her lineage, is not a bearer of the system. Any other core would simply devour the pattern. So, wrote the builder with the blood of 300 years of solitude. There is no choice. There is only obedience. And then he added a second thought of his own. He said that in his entire past life he had been a man who was enough for everyone but himself, and that had been a bad life. But in this life, for the first time, he is enough for an entire city. So even if only half remains, it will be more than anything he ever had before. There were 6 days left until Ansgar's pattern closed. The work was in full swing. Brenna and the veterans, following the system's instructions, were installing conductive masts from the upper reservoirs down to the core. Sigrun was marking out the contour of the reforging over Ansgar's black lines, having memorized it from the archives. Leora was preparing what Kale had whispered to her. The means to keep him alive and separated during the first few hours. Astrid did not leave Kale's side, her blade drawn because the statues below had become restless. The pattern sensed the work of an outsider. On the 4th day, Ansgar understood everything. From below, from the core chamber, his voice rose, amplified by the ice to the volume of thunder. The supreme voice was no longer preaching. He was in a hurry. He shouted that since the guests were in a hurry, he would hurry as well. And the black lines of the pattern flared up all at once. Ansgar fed his own life into the circuit prematurely, burning himself like a wick. The system recalculated the timelines, and the new numbers lay before Kale like a verdict. 30 hours until the essence awoke. 40 hours until the reforging circuit was ready at the current pace. 10 hours were missing, and there was nowhere to get them from. The 10 missing hours hum over the camp like a sword of Damocles. Kale gathered everyone by the masts and laid out the math aloud. The circuit couldn't be sped up. The masts were being erected at the speed of stone and ice. That meant they had to slow down not their own work, but someone else's. We had to slow down the closing of the pattern below. The pattern was powered by 20 guards and Ansgar's will. We couldn't kill the guards, but we could tie up the statue. Every guard drawn into battle contributed less power to the pattern. A battle right at the pattern itself would buy us 10 hours against the invulnerable ones. Astrid listened and smiled the same way she had before the rift, when it was 2 against 3. She said she spent her whole life waiting for a battle that couldn't be won, one where you just had to avoid losing for as long as possible. She selected 60 veterans out of 200. Brenna gave them everything that was in the supply train: collapsible shields, grappling hooks, ropes to topple the statues and bind them with chains to the columns. Leora administered a triple dose of the call resistance potion to each of them and went down with them herself, carrying stretchers for those suffering from frostbite, because there would be no wounded in this battle. There would only be those suffering from frostbite. The battle in the core hall began 28 hours before the awakening and became the strangest battle in the north. 60 people weren't trying to win. They were dancing. They hooked the statues with grappling hooks, toppled them, bound them with chains to the columns, and leaped back. The statues would break the chains every hour and advance again, only to be knocked down once more. The people rotated in waves at Astrid's whistle. Leora dragged the frostbitten ones upstairs to warm them by the crystals, and half would return downstairs. The pattern below flickered and faltered. The system upstairs recalculated the timers every hour, and the gap was closing. 40 against 30. 36 against 28. 30 against 25. Kale had been working by the masts without sleep for the second day straight and could feel how, a mile of stone below, his men were paying for every hour of his work with their fingers and faces. By the end of the second day, the gap had closed to 0. The outline and the pattern now converged nose to nose toward a single point in time. Everything hinged on the final hours, and in those final hours there was no margin for anything. And then Ansgar made his final move. He was no longer human. The wick had burned out. What stood at the center of the pattern was a shadow in a robe with eyes like 2 ice holes. The shadow realized that the clock was running out and let out a cry at full force. Not a song, a scream. The scream struck the hall and the entire spiral of the city. Leora's potion burned in the people's blood like paper. Astrid's veterans fell to their knees, covering their ears. 3 stood up and walked toward the pattern, smiling. Up above, near the masts, everyone except the 3 of them collapsed. Kale held his ground because the system was jamming the call. Brenna held her ground because she had sunk her teeth into her own hand until it bled, and the pain kept her steady. And Sigrun held her ground because the call was familiar to her and could not command her. It could only call. Sigrun glanced at Kale over her shoulder. There was no fear in her high-set eyes. In them was a decision apparently made back on the mountain passes. She said she would buy him his 10 hours. She said she had no intention of dying and that he had to make it in time because she would be waiting inside. And before Kale could take a step, she stepped herself from the edge of the gallery down into a mile of emptiness, and the ice accepted her as water accepts a drop. She passed through the wall of the pattern that had repelled Astrid. The guards parted before her because the pattern recognized the rock. Sigrun approached the frozen heart amid the cry of the shadow. Ansgar's cry placed both palms on the ice and began to sing. 60 people below witnessed this and recounted it for the rest of their lives. Her voice stood against the scream like a stream against a blizzard, and the stream prevailed. She did not unravel the pattern. She would not have had the strength for that. She sang a lullaby to the sleeper, the lullaby of her own kind, from within the pattern, and the sleeper lingered. The awakening did not stop. The awakening lingered. The system above showed Kale what he had clung to as if it were his very life. The awakening's deadline crept backward. 1 hour, 3, 7, 10, 12. Ice crept up Sigrun's arms as she sang, to her elbow, to her shoulder. She sang and froze into what she was lulling to sleep, becoming the 21st statue in the hall, facing the heart, not turning away from it. Kale turned toward the masts and bellowed, rousing the dazed. The next few hours blurred into one. Brenna hammered the final joints into the ice, her hands numb. Astrid's veterans below used their chains to cut away the guards' last shred of freedom. Leora darted between the frostbitten, and 2 hours before the new deadline, the entire circuit was complete. Kale stood at the center of the circuit on a platform directly above the very heart. Below, beneath a mile of transparent ice, the entity hung, and at its feet, a small figure, frozen up to its chest, still sang. He opened the system and accepted it all at once, the transformation of the anchor, the fusion with the core of the dead city, and the reforging. The world vanished. There was no longer any top or bottom. Kale became the city. He felt each of the 1,000 towers as if they were his own fingers. He felt the reservoirs as lungs filled with millennia-old cold. He felt the essence like a tumor in his own chest. And he felt 2 hot spots. Sigrun singing near his heart. And far to the south, 100 miles away, a tiny warm ember. The warm stone. His first home, which was no longer his anchor, and because of that had only grown more precious. The reforging had begun. The system was dismantling the essence just as he had once dismantled the rock to build his first room, only now the blocks were centuries of someone else's hunger. The power of the reservoirs and everything the city had earned flowed through him and burned. And then came the core's turn. The system asked without words, what portion of his will would the bearer surrender to the new hearth? And Kale did what he had decided back at the archive but hadn't told anyone. He refused to split himself in half blindly. He gave the hearth what he knew best about himself. He gave it that version of himself from his past life, the man who was always warming others, but never knew how to take that warmth for himself. The invisible office worker who toiled away at other people's work through the night. The one who died at a crosswalk while rushing to handle someone else's business. All that old pain, all that warmth never given to anyone, all that need to be needed, accumulated over 2 lifetimes. He poured into the core in one go. It turned out to be a lot, more than half. The system accepted it and began to weave. And with his final movement, already losing himself at the edges, Kale reached, driven by the will of the city, toward the small singing figure in the ice and wove her into the core beside himself, not as a core, but as a guardian. So that the hearth would always hear a lullaby, and so that she who had agreed to an icy eternity would receive warmth. There was no explosion, quite the opposite, a breath. The Black City took its first breath in 1,000 years. The black ice of the towers glowed from within and turned amber. The purple glow over the basin curled up and faded. And from the core, a wave spread upward and in all directions. Warmth, not heat. The steady living warmth of a hearth you want to sit by. The wave swept through the hall and the 20 statues crumbled into handfuls of clear water. Ansgar's shadow melted away silently, his face bearing, in that final moment, not defeat but the bewilderment of a child from whom a simple answer had been taken away. The wave continued beyond the basin, over the mountain passes, across the entire north, and wherever it passed, the eternal leaden veil of clouds thinned and tore apart. Astrid burst onto the upper platform first. Kale lay in the center of the circle, breathing. She fell to her knees beside him and began calling his name. He didn't open his eyes right away, and he didn't look at her right away, recognizing her as if he were returning from a great depth. Then he recognized her. Then he smiled. The smile was his. Leora pushed her way in behind her and clasped his wrist, checking his pulse. There was a pulse. He was alive. How much of the man remained would take months to discover, but his eyes looked clear, and in those eyes he was there. With their help, he sat up, and the first thing he asked about was his people down below. Then he asked about Sigrun, and the system answered before the people did, unfolding before him a new main thread of his life. Construction complete. The Great Hearth of the North. Carrier status. Anchor guardian of 2 refuges. Heat radiation radius. Growing. A guardian has been discovered inside the hearth. Condition. Sleep. Awakening possible as conditions stabilize. Prognosis favorable. Kale read the word favorable and laughed and couldn't stop, and 60 frostbitten veterans below heard that laughter through a mile of amber ice and didn't understand yet smiled themselves. And outside, over the dead city, it was raining for the first time in 1,000 years. It took 3 weeks to return home because the way back was not the way back. The road led through the north, which was changing before our eyes. The wave of the hearth rolled ahead of the detachment. The cloudy veil that had hung over the world for generations was dissipating day by day, and the people in the settlements they passed through would emerge from their dugouts and stand with their heads tilted back toward the blue gaps in the sky, unable to take their eyes off them. The snow hadn't disappeared. Winter didn't end in a single day, but winter ceased to be eternal. It became simply winter, with the promise of spring at the end. All along the way, Leora watched Kale as both a healer and a friend. Their separation had left its mark, and those marks were strange. He remembered everything. He remained true to himself in his decisions, his attachments, and his laughter. Something else was gone. The old thorn was gone. Astrid put it bluntly and accurately during a rest stop. She said that before, even when resting, he would sit like a man who owed something to someone. But now he sits like a man who is at home. Kale listened and realized she was right. The one who had forever been paying an invisible debt remained in the north and became a hearth for the whole world. The debt was paid off forever. The warm stone greeted them so loudly it rang in their ears. The entire city poured out onto the walls and the plateau. 5,000 voices roared and droplets flew from the icy walls like fireworks. The boy king broke every rule of protocol, ran down from the gate tower and threw his arms around Kale's neck in front of the chancellor, the jarls, and the army. Einar was already reporting the news at the table. Sigwald had raced to the capital with 100 men, but the capital would not let him in. The city had heard of the defeat and of the letters from the crown. The jarls were captured by their own captains and handed over to the council in chains, having bargained for their own pardon. Halfdan adjourned the trial until the king's return. Kale insisted that the trial be a trial and not a massacre. Sigwald was tried in open court before the entire north, with each burned jarlship read aloud. The Jarl remained defiant until halfway through the reading and broke down and begged for mercy. The sentence was handed down by the Crown Council, not execution. Cale spoke words at the council that were later minted at the mint. He said that the North had fed the earth with the dead for too long, and that from now on even enemies would pay not with blood but with labor. Sigvald and the remnants of his loyal followers were sent to the Northern Trail for life, to build a road to the hearth through the mountain passes, under guard, with no right of return. It was said later that years later the old Jarl became the best foreman of roadworks and died in his sleep in a warm barrack built with his own hands. Spring arrived with the thaw, according to the calendar, and by fall it had spread across the entire plain. The North's first collective harvest in 40 years was gathered by the whole community, and they sang in the fields. Warmstone now grew not as a fortress, but as what it was destined to become from that first room in the rock, a capital. A year later, the Council of Jarls and the Crown officially moved the throne of the young king to Warmstone, because the old capital by the frozen bay was thawing slowly, while the life of the North was already pulsing here. Cale refused all the titles they offered him, Lord Protector, Duke, and Governor. He kept only one for himself, Master of the Hearth. The system now lived within him differently, quietly. It no longer showered him with rewards for every wall, because the guardian anchor drew directly from both refuges. It became simply a vision through which he saw both of his homes, the south teeming with people, and the northern one full of warmth. Between them lay Sigwald's road, and the first pilgrims, scholars, and the merely curious were already making their way along the road to the hearth. The Amber City beyond the mountain passes was becoming a place where the North went to warm itself and marvel. Cale appointed guardians there from among the veterans of that battle of attrition. 60 men with frostbitten faces were now considered saints in the North and were terribly embarrassed by this. Personal matters were settled that same fall, amid scandals, laughter, and in the Northern way. Astrid was the first to decide everything, because Astrid always decided first. She came to him that evening at the watchtower, stood beside him as if in a night of black glow, and said that she had followed him from the rift to the edge of the world, and that she intended to continue on as his wife, because her role as a bodyguard had run its course. Cale replied that he agreed on one condition. The sword in the bedroom must not hang over his half of the bed. The whole city celebrated the wedding for 3 days, and a month later, Leora simply moved her herbs and books into their wing, and in response to Cale's questioning look, she said calmly that the temple had taught her to stay where she was needed most, and that it was useless to argue with the temple's teachings. Astrid laughed out loud and moved over. Brenna held out the longest and arrived last winter, as grumpy as a badger. She slammed a ring of her own forging, made of starlight metal, down on the table in front of Cale, and said she'd reforge it 4 times because she couldn't bring herself to admit she was forging it for herself, and that if he smiled now, she'd take the ring back. Cale didn't smile. Cale put on the ring. He smiled later. The northern laws of old allowed for households with many wives, and the council merely grunted, and the city gossiped happily all winter long because the city needs something to gossip about. Cale thought of Sigrun every day. Once a season, he would set out alone along the road to the north. The anchor of the 2 refuges could now move freely between them, as if between rooms in a single house. He would descend into the amber hall, sit by the warm heart of the hearth, and talk. He would tell her about the city. Harvests, weddings, funny stories. The system displayed her dream as a steady golden glow and a forecast line where the stabilization number was slowly rising. By the 5th spring, the number had reached its limit. Cale was alone in the hall when the golden glow flickered. The ice at the base of the heart melted into warm water, and Sigrun opened her eyes. She emerged from the heart of the hearth as one emerges from water, alive, warm, with eyes no longer sky blue but simply blue. She held his hand, learning to stand again, and listened to 5 years' worth of news all jumbled together. In the middle of the story about Brenna's ring, she cried and laughed at the same time. The gift remained with her, but it had changed, just as she herself had. Her ice no longer took away the warmth. It preserved it. They walked home for 2 weeks, taking their time, and a clear sky hung over them the whole time. And then there was the night that Cale remembered as the true turning point of the whole story. An ordinary night, long afterward. He stood on the very top platform of warm stone. Below, the city of 20,000 residents was aglow with lights. In the children's room, 2 of his children were asleep, and they were expecting a 3rd by summer. Somewhere in the blacksmith's quarter, Brenna's hammer still rang out. Her pregnancy hadn't stopped her from forging. In the infirmary, Leora's window was lit. Astrid was checking the guard posts because Astrid always checked the guard posts. Sigrun was growing impossible blue flowers made of ice in the new greenhouse. They smelled of winter freshness and did not melt. Kale looked at all this, and the system displayed before him the last long line he had ever seen from it. The carrier's task is complete. The refuge has become the world. The world has become the refuge. The carrier shall determine future goals on his own. The system is entering legacy mode. He asked her mentally what legacy meant. The system replied briefly. One day in some world, someone else will freeze, and what Kale has built here will become the first line of help for that freezing person. Just as, long ago, a stranger's archive had been a source of help for Kale himself. The cycle never ended. The cycle warmed him. Kale stood there a little longer. Then, out loud into the warm night, he said, "Thank you." It wasn't clear to whom. To the system. To the builder. To that machine at the earthly crossing. To all of them at once. And he walked down the stairs of his house to where the light was on and they were waiting for him. They no longer counted extra mouths to feed in the north. In the north, they counted the harvests of children and the years until the king came of age. And the story of the boy who was thrown out to freeze in a snowdrift and who, in response, warmed the whole world was told on winter evenings by the hearths, from the southern passes to the Amber City. And every storyteller ended it with the same words. Winter comes and goes. Home remains.